Good morning. Welcome to the April 12th Grants Pass City Council Workshop. We have a couple people out at the moment. I know Councilor Frazier will be out all day. At the moment, Councilor De La Grange and Councilor Pell are also absent. I am expecting them. And we're going to kick off our meeting today with a discussion. We have an airport funding request from the county, and I believe Susan Searider is here to lead the presentation.
Good morning, Mayor and Council, and we're doing tag team. I'm the liaison to the Collaborative Economic Development Committee, and we have the chair, Gene Merrill, is here from the CEDC, and so he and I are both going to give this presentation. After the presentation, we do have Larry Graves from the airport. He's the director of the airport, and he's here to answer any specific questions and give you more information. So the subject is currently asking for, the airport manager, director, is asking for a 700-foot extension of the runway at the Grants Pass Airport to satisfy the growing demand in heavier aircraft. This project will be funded 90% by the FAA, and it requires a 10% match. Now, originally, the ask was for a 1,500-foot extension. In October of 2020, the FAA threw a curveball and declared that they would fund only the 700-foot extension rather than the full 1,500 feet. And the runway extension is required to safely operate larger jets that Grants Pass businesses are using to drive expansion and greater economic benefit for Grants Pass. And the relationship to your council goals is to encourage economic opportunities by facilitating an environment to encourage business prosperity and economic opportunities.
The CEDC made a motion a little over a year ago, just before COVID, for the City Council and the County Commissioners to consider supportive funding for this airport project. At that point in time, it was a 1,500-foot airport expansion. There still is potential for that to happen. Larry was just talking about how there's actually a congressional inquiry into the reasoning behind denying the 1,500-foot extension for us. City staff, Susan gave a presentation in 2020 in preparation for the joint city council meeting so they could discuss the CEDC recommendations and updates. And the council's consensus at that time was this was an important economic development opportunity and chance for partnership. In fact, this is something that has been on various councils' agendas for a while. When the CEDC was formed, you'll notice the first sheet of the CEDC bylaws given to us by the council, and one of the items on there specifically is funding for the Grants Pass Airport. So due to COVID, everything just kind of came to a standstill, and this is kind of continuing business that we would like to get the ball rolling on once again.
I wanted to bring up, too, that the current work plan right now does identify the following council goal, and it's under Encourage Economic Opportunities. Objective 1 is to facilitate an environment to encourage business prosperity and economic opportunities. And Action 5 points out exploring partnerships opportunities to enhance the Grants Pass Airport.
The airports in Josephine County are a critical business component. We see that especially with some of the larger employers within the city of Grants Pass. They rely heavily on the airport infrastructure for expansion into other areas. We have businesses like Rogue Valley Door, who also have businesses up in Washington. Dutch Brothers, who we all know is doing massive expansions all over. So a larger airport is definitely a critical need. Josephine County Airports currently are managing 12 state and federal grants, totaling over $7 million. For every dollar invested, there are a minimum of $9 in grant funding provided by the FAA. So the airport director has to secure a 10% match from city and county sources in order to complete these projects. County has already agreed to contribute $150,000 a year from lottery dollars over 5 years as a grant match. The CEDC's original recommendation to the city council was a $50,000 a year commitment over 5 years. Now, last year with everything that happened with COVID, we kind of got set off to the side there. Grants Pass, using the aircraft that they base, brought in over $700 million in operating revenue in 2019. There are 159 aircraft based at the Grants Pass Airport, and of those, 35 are owned by city residents or city-owned businesses. In fact, 22 are city-owned businesses. So it is an important component for some of our larger businesses here. 76 are owned by county residents, 48 are owned by other city residents, so people from out of the area who have aircraft stationed here. So another tourism dollars coming into our area, people from other areas bringing dollars into our area. There are 136 single engine, 18 multi-engine, 3 jets, and 2 helicopters.
So there is a revenue source identified, and that would be the Industrial Development Fund. This Industrial Development Fund has really had a lot of activity, and one of them was last year when COVID hit. The City Council directed staff to find a funding source to help businesses with a grant, and the city offered a $2,500 grant. Those funds came out of the Industrial Development Fund, and the city helped over 405 businesses, totaling over $756,000 in grant funding, and all of that money came back. So it's back in the fund again. We've also utilized it again. The city and county had a grant. Right at the end of the year, we did another $1,500. And again, we got that funding back. So we do have funding available, and there's $360,000 budgeted right now for grants or loan programs for economic development. I'll let you go with that.
So since the initial request was kind of tabled due to a item, how would we figure out where this funding comes from? We've now solved that, and we have a revenue stream where this money could come from in order to move these projects forward. So money could come from the general fund via reduction in services or a drawdown in contingency funds, or it could come from this industrial development fund that we have. The original request of the council was $50,000 per year for 5 years. And of course, we missed 1 year since it was a project that we were hoping to start last year. So it would have been a total $250,000 for the runway at 1,500 feet. Now, it's still a very real possibility. So the council could decide to do the $50,000 per year. The airport says that they can accept amount of $43,750 a year over a 4-year period. So that would be a total of $175,000 to help fund that 10% match. So since we're behind a year, the CEDC would like to request that the council does consider that this year the funding for last year and this year be allocated towards this project to catch up.
And so the call to action is at your discretion. We do have Larry Graves, the airport manager, here. If anyone has any specific questions for Larry, or either questions for Jean and or I.
Thank you. Joel?
It seems like transportation infrastructure, whether it's streets, airports, or whatever, waterways are important and typically funded by government. So just to clarify what you're requesting there, you're requesting the city to fund 2.5%, and the other 97.5% would come from the county and the FAA. Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct.
So we fund 2.5% of the costs, and it leverages 97.5% of the dollars required to build the extended runway.
Yeah. So 90% would come from the federal government, and yet the rest would come from the county.
So we need you in other avenues of our city to bring in these matching grants, so we just pay 2.5% of all our programs.
We can turn our 6th and 7th Street into runways for Larry then.
No. Okay, well, thank you for that clarification.
It's an interesting tourism twist as well. Rick and then Brian.
Thank you for the presentation. I think this is a good idea. But I do have a question on the Industrial Development Fund. Right now, it sits at $360,000. What is the revenue to come in and replenish any of that amount, or is there?
That is a fund that has been within the city for probably 10 years now, and it's not replenished. So once those funds are depleted, there is no more funding. We are using some of the funds from the Industrial Development Fund for loans. We have the micro enterprise loans. We have a partnership with IVCDO. So those funds are coming back because they're being issued as loans. But a grant, it's gone.
So I want to add to that, one of the questions came up at one of your last council meetings where you did provide system development charge incentives and reimbursement through a grant program. So by utilizing these funds in this industrial loan fund, you will be utilizing those type of resources and reduce ultimately the city's future ability to continue to do those type of grant programs to small businesses within the city, because this is one of our last funds that we utilize that type of business matching grants for.
Brian, then Valerie.
I think I'm going to defer my questions until after Larry speaks.
Okay, my question was, it's coming back to, of course, we all hear right now coming from Washington, D.C., infrastructure, and so there is the potential to have infrastructure money, and of course, airports are part of that infrastructure. So my question is, and this is partly to Aaron, if we do get some money back, can we utilize that money as opposed to using this? I mean, can we change it in mid-course, I guess, is my question.
Of course, nothing's set in stone yet, but from the magic 8 ball that I have on my desk and what we're getting from the federal government from information, we're not seeing that airports would be a usable purpose, but water and wastewater capital infrastructure would be. So the likelihood that some of the monies that we're going to be getting coming into us, right now we do not see where we could replenish anything we give to them through those grant funds.
That's referring to the American Recovery Act. That's not referring to the future transport. Am I correct?
Yeah, and again, that's a really unknown at this point, and so I don't really have the ability to respond to that question.
I think none of us. So I'm just going to say congratulations, and I hear you're going to retire soon. So what are the plans for the airport as we move forward through? And you said you saw the potential of it going from the 700-foot to the 1,500. So do you want to expand upon that, Larry?
Sure, very much so. First of all, I want to make sure this is on.
It's not. So make sure the little silver button.
There we go. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Thank you. Well, didn't want to push anything unless I knew exactly what it was going to do. It's one of the first things they teach you when you become a pilot. Don't push that button unless you know what's going to happen. And it is a little bit of a chaotic situation, as Mr. Kubik explained. We have, I will mention, federal legislative earmarks. We have state legislative earmarks. We have county monies, and it's all kind of a 52 pickup, and we don't really know where this is going to land at this point. So my philosophy has been, blinders on, let's forge ahead as if no money is forthcoming, and we need to make our plans in that regard. So we have a very real possibility of getting the full 1,500-foot extension, and the reason for that is the FAA has very rigid interpretations of their policies about justification for spending money on infrastructure. And they don't include economic benefit, believe it or not. So if you can expand your runway 700 feet for $7 million, We could go the full 1,500 feet for a total of 10 or less. And it doesn't make any economic sense to not do that because, first of all, it'll cost a lot less per foot to do that, in the full 1,500 foot length. And secondly, the FAA will not revisit the question for another 15 or 20 years. And in the meantime, we're currently a 4,000 foot runway. A 700 foot extension will obviously give us a 4,700 foot runway. And I'm told by the operators of the jet aircraft that we have, and who are also looking at purchasing more jet aircraft, that they need 5,400 feet to operate at all times in a safe manner. And the limiting factor is takeoff. You're always the heaviest when you're taking off. And the jets that are flying at the airport do not have thrust reversers. They're the size of jet that's on the lower end of the scale of corporate aircraft. So they rely entirely on their brakes for a safe stop. So if a pilot accelerates to takeoff speed and then loses an engine, for example, and these things happen, pilots are trained to deal with this, they have to rely on their brakes to stop from nearly flying speed. And so they're on the runway, and if the runway is wet, or if it's 100 degrees out, which occasionally happens up at Merlin, they won't be able to stop on the existing runway, even at 4,700 feet. We've made that argument to the FAA, and they say, well, it's not often enough. We're going to look at how many times this jet flies, these jets fly in 2020, and we'll make our final decision near the end of 2020. Well, guess what happened? Nobody flew. Nobody flew anywhere. Why fly across the country or across the state if you can't sit down and have a face-to-face meeting with the people you want to talk to? So our flight operations plummeted by 95%. Sales of fuel plummeted. That's a source of revenue. So it's been a very difficult situation. And all the flight numbers, flight operations, takeoffs and landings plummeted. And the FAA looked at that and they said, you just don't have the numbers to justify this long runway. Well, I can safely say, I would guarantee, in fact, personally, that if COVID had never happened, we would have exceeded the FAA's requirements for that count of 500 operations per year by the largest aircraft that uses the airport, and easily. And it would have made their job a lot easier to justify spending $10 million as opposed to $7 million on the runway extension. So that's the current situation.
Larry, did you have a presentation, or are you just here to answer questions?
I'm here to answer questions and add any little tiny bits of wisdom that I possibly can to this discussion. So I'm at your beck and
Okay,
call.
we'll go Brian, then Kurt.
Thanks, Larry. So I had a couple questions. The first one is, who are the biggest non-government users of the airport?
Oh, gosh. We have no government users of the airport. So the biggest non-government user of the airport is the 800-pound gorilla, and that's Dutch Bros. They have a fleet. They have, until recently, I think they just sold one of their Conquests, which is a 10-passenger, small airliner, actually. They have 3 of those, plus they have the Cessna CJ4 jet, which is also a 10-passenger jet. And that's the critical aircraft for our airport. It's the largest, heaviest plane that uses that runway on a regular basis. So there's Dutch Bros, there's Southwest Transport, there's PacJet Charter, there's Pacific Aviation, who do flight instruction. There's Rogue Valley Door, there's a number of businesses. I'm sure I'm leaving out about half of them, but Dutch Bros is clearly the largest. You know, they probably are responsible for at least half of all the takeoffs and landings out of the airport.
Okay. So when we have other people come to the city to request funding for projects, a lot of times we like to see fundraising from other sources, which obviously this is a multi-funding source project. But I guess what I'm getting at is, has there been any request or opportunity given to the private company owners that use the airport to help fund this extension?
Yes, I have made informal inquiries of Dutch Bros Board of Directors, Keith Tomajan in particular. They have indicated verbally that they are willing to contribute toward the various steps that are required moving forward. We're doing an environmental assessment currently, which is about a $350,000 project. And in order to expand that to cover the full 1,500 feet, as opposed to just a 700-foot environmental, will require $30,000 to $40,000 of additional funding. And I have requested Pacific Aviation, Dutch Bros, PacJet, several of the other companies out there to think about that. Would they be willing to contribute? Several private pilots who fly their airplanes strictly for business, they have also said they're willing to pitch in to make sure that we get the environmental assessment that covers the full 1,500-foot runway. The reason that's important is because if we just do a 700-foot environmental today, and then the money arrives from heaven to do the full construction project, we will not be able to do that because we haven't performed the full 1,500-foot runway assessment. So we're in the process of getting an approval from the FAA right now for the statement of work to cover the 700 and the 1,500. We're going to do the full environmental assessment for the full length extension to FAA and NEPA specifications so that it will be a valid environmental assessment and it'll be usable by the FAA when they justify the 1,500-foot construction.
Very good. And you mentioned Dutch Bros is about half of the use.
Yeah,
of
about
the,
a third to a half. Mhm.
Okay. Would it be safe to say that they're probably the company that would benefit the most from this extension out there?
I think they would benefit quite a bit. I think it would be safe to say that.
Okay, and then just one last question.
I mean, just to illustrate your point very quickly, when they take off right now with full seats, there's 10 people in the aircraft, they take off and say they're going to Texas or New Mexico or Tennessee or Montana, which is these are common trips for them right now because they're expanding all over the western United States. They take off at 6 or 6:30 in the morning and they fly directly to Medford and they land and they fill up with jet fuel at Medford Airport because they can't take off with full tanks and full seats from Grants Pass. And so the chief pilot at Dutch Bros tells me that 30% of their flights are impacted in this manner, and it's going to get worse as they add to their fleet. And I'm afraid that they're going to be making decisions about where they base their aviation department on the availability of an adequate runway.
Sure. And just one quick last question, just out of curiosity, do you have any idea of the cost of one of those larger jets that they utilize?
$10 million.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Kurt?
The presentation says that the airport generated $700 million in 2019. And I'm curious, a two-part question. What was the operating cost over that period of time? And what would you forecast as far as increase if you had the 1,500-foot extension?
Great questions. First part, the money that I'm talking about, the $700 million that was generated, it's revenue that flows into the businesses that are based here that call Grants Pass their home. And all that money flows through those businesses, through the city, and then back out again into whatever investments they're going to make. The airport itself is an enterprise fund, and we can only spend money after we have earned it. This is going to be a tough year for us because we didn't earn nearly as much money in 2020 as we had expected due to the low flight volumes, et cetera. But our operating costs every year are just under $1 million, and that covers staff, all of our equipment, et cetera. And we currently only have 3 people, and we run 2 airports with 3 people, so we're very efficient. Second part of the question. The just to expand, we will probably see a doubling of the revenue over the next 5 years if we had that full-length extension. Due to the expansion of Dutch Bros in particular, and I can't speak for them, but I have had a lot of communication with their flight department and with their board of directors. Keith Tomajan in particular has been my point of contact. And, you know, 5 years ago, they were 160 coffee kiosks, and they made the decision to put an aviation program in place to facilitate their expansion. Today, they're over 400 kiosks, and they're going to be 800 within the next 4 years. And they cannot do that without an aviation department that's very active and very efficient and easily reached, located close to home. They don't want to have to drive back and forth to Medford every time they're going to take a flight.
So would you anticipate with the expansion that there would be more aircraft based at the airport?
Absolutely.
At the 159 right now, is there capacity for more?
There is. We have the room to expand. All of our hangars are subscribed. We have no vacancy, but it takes money to build hangars. And I don't have the ability to earn the money required until, to build those hangars. So it's a chicken or egg kind of a concept. I've run lots of business cases. What size hangar building can we afford to build? And then immediately rent it and have all of that revenue perform debt service so that we don't really have any money out of pocket. But it takes a hump of money to get started doing that, which we don't have. So,
Thank you.
Joel?
Couple things. One is you do have some use from firefighting efforts out there. It's a helicopter and a
every year, very much so.
every year. And I know when there's operations that need to be supported in the summertime, a lot of people fly into the Medford Airport and then get on a car and come up here to Grants Pass. And it would be nice to have it down there. But the other thing I thought of as being a government economist at one time, capital investments are investments, not expenses. And you look at direct benefits, you look at indirect benefits, and you look at what they call induced benefits.
Yeah.
And of this $50,000 that we would invest, what would come back to us in terms of benefits, well, first off, you got a $7 million capital investment.
Correct, at a minimum.
And then you have people coming in that use motels, hotels. You have a stimulation of business, and it becomes a great investment that has a return on it that benefits the city's business climate. It's like Spalding Park, but Spalding Park right now would take a lot more money, and there's no money to leverage. So we would be on the bill for the whole thing of those direct, indirect, and induced benefits. So if you want to do economic development, it seems to me this is very much has a positive cost-benefit ratio and is very worth the time. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Of course, I'm very biased, but I also look at this from a detached, objective business case point of view. Mm-hmm. And I would point out that when a runway reaches 5,000 feet in length, it suddenly appears on all the corporate jet flight planning programs. If you're less than 5,000 feet, most corporate jet operators will not be able to come into the airport because it doesn't meet their insurance requirements. Because they know that once it lands here, it has to fill up with fuel and take off again, which is the critical operation, is takeoff. To address Mr. Kubik's point from earlier, you will deplete perhaps this $360,000 fund, and you have to ask yourselves, is the benefit from having the expanded runway and all the horse racing people coming in their corporate jets to watch their horses run, and all the Dutch Bros activity, et cetera, is that worth keeping versus not having it happen.
Rob?
2 points. Can you say again, how long would it be for the FAA to be able to reevaluate this if it doesn't happen now?
If they are directed to reevaluate it as a result of the current congressional inquiry, and I was the person who pulled the pin on that grenade and tossed it into the room, it will happen very quickly. If it is going to happen as a result of FAA deliberations and we'll decide, a year from now kind of thing, it'll be a while. It'll be 12 to 18 months in the future. And they have said, if we receive discretionary funds, and we have no idea if we will or not, then we will consider your eligible project. But we have no guarantees.
What did you say earlier about, you mentioned something about 10 years, but I'm sorry I didn't quite catch that.
I don't recall exactly what it was that I was talking about then, but we have a 5-year capital improvement plan, which is a constantly updated, rolling capital plan. And this runway extension is programmed into the federal spending. The 700-foot extension is absolutely going to happen. My job is to make sure it's a 1,500-foot extension, which gets us the full 5,500 feet of runway that we really need to operate. And 10 years from now, it's going to be a much different economic climate here, I'm sure.
Earlier, Larry, you were saying that if we do the 700-foot runway, if we don't fund for the 1,500, it could be 15 to 20 years before they would revisit?
That is correct.
Yeah, that's what I was, that's the
Okay,
question I
sure,
had.
sure. Thank
And
you.
then the other, thank you, yeah. The other question I had was, can you go over again to what degree you have, I think you said it was verbal commitments, but I don't know how valuable they are, but you said you had commitments from Dutch Bros or some of the other private players on some of the investment they were going to make on environmental impact and things. So how certain is it that they actually are going to, they would be willing to contribute to that?
I think they're very stand-up people that I've been dealing with and communicating, and I think that it's a sure bet that they will help us fund the additional environmental assessment. And of course, it's a big, long project. We had to do a new master plan update and an airport layout plan update. We have completed that. It recommends a full 1,500-foot extension. And I can make that available to any of you if you'd like to see it. That doesn't guarantee that the FAA will agree to that, however. So the second phase is the environmental assessment. The third phase is the design and partial construction, and there will probably be a fourth phase of completion of the project. One of the other elements here is that I always ask the state to contribute, and that is never guaranteed that it will happen. So once again, it's possible that we receive all the money we need and the city won't have to put out a penny. But I don't see that as a guarantee, and that's why I'm here and have been communicating with the CEDC for several years now about this upcoming project.
So the question, I guess, I don't know if it would be for you, Larry, it might be more for Aaron or Mark. Is there a way to make the city's contribution to this conditional on them raising from private sector the money, the $350,000 for environmental impact?
You certainly could do that.
Are there other questions?
You run the risk of me talking more, so look out,
Looks like we've exhausted our questions for the moment. Thank you for the presentation. Thanks for being here, Larry.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it very much.
Discussion, where do we go from here? Joel?
Well, having worked in the public sector for a long time and having programs that benefit certain industries. You know, I'm not objecting to what Ron said and making it conditional on that support, but government throughout its whole history has, for example, provided timber sales that benefit the wood products industry. And the wood products industry didn't pay a dime for that. They did competitively bid for the timber, and they did do that, but they didn't do the environmental assessments. They didn't plant the trees, though the money that they bid for the wood planted the trees. And it benefited the entire area economically, and it had social cohesion, and it helped build roads. It built the county courthouse. It built the caveman swimming pool. It built the YMCA. And so when we invest in ourselves, in the infrastructure like the airport, I have no objection to what Councilor Pell did, and I would, because I'm sure that they will come through. But regardless of that, it's a good investment for our social cohesion as we move forward as a community. And I think it's very important that we do so.
Valerie?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Joel. I think the airport is an economic driver. As long as I have been on council, I have watched the CEDC come forward, and the CEDC is a city and county committee, and it's been one of the things that I have honored, because, you know, they struggled in the beginning because there were so many people on the committee, but they're kind of coming around. And I was excited about that committee for the very reason that it is an economic driver for both the city and the county. I understand, you know, Rob and Brian's, you know, concern of making sure that the private industry is doing their part, but I think they do their part. I think if you were to look at the economic development and the driver in our economics in Grants Pass, you're going to see that some of those people who use the airport, that's where our employers of our community are. And I think as we move forward and try to get more large employers to move into our area, you need to provide them with an airport that they could easily get in and out of. So I am in full support. I'm in support. I've always been in support of the $50,000, just because I believe so much that having economic vitality, which is what we want in our community, involves opening ourselves up outside business. And I hear over and over again, that's what we need to do, is bring in business to our community. And in order to bring in the type of business I think that we want in our community, we need to have an airport that's viable.
Brian?
So I am in full support of the airport extending the runway. I think that the airport is an important economic driver for our community. And I think that that is going to happen regardless of whether or not the city chooses to fund a part of this project. I think if the city decided to not fund it, I think it's still going to happen. I think that the $175,000 that is being asked for from the city represents 1.75% of the cost of one of the Dutch Bros jets, which is basically nothing to them. So it would be no problem for them alone to fund this. And it's our job as city council to be stewards of the public trust and the public funds. And given the fact that this project is going to happen, whether or not we decide to spend $175,000 of the city's money, I would choose to have us not fund it and have that funding come from the companies that are going to benefit the most from it.
Rick?
I like seeing the support that's out there for the airport expansion, and I would be also in favor of it. I appreciate, and I think Joel and Valerie have been very eloquent in listing the reasons for it. One other aspect I'd like to just throw in there, when you have a government application and you're looking for participation, the more people or businesses or government entities that you have participating in a project, it really enhances the application to make it feasible. In other words, if the FAA wants to consider that extension, the mere fact that the City of Grants Pass is also endorsing it and providing money for that very purpose raises their level of consideration to include it. So for that reason, I would be in favor of funding this request. Thank you.
Vanessa?
Listening to discussion today, it's really interesting, the variances of opinion. I would have to agree with Councilor DeLagrange that I am also in support of this airport expansion, but I have a couple of concerns. The highest beneficiary of this potential contribution from the city has an annual revenue 4 times of what the city's total budget is. That's a big concern for me. I don't believe that folks who are interested in watching horse races coming on their corporate jets will cease to come to this community to watch horse races, as we are one of the only horse racing facilities in the state of Oregon, I believe the only with that license. And I do believe, along with Councilor DeLagrange, that significant portion of this, the contribution should be coming from the highest beneficiaries. The document that we received back in strategic planning, I don't know if anyone still has this, but it's some pretty significant corporations. And I think it does bear repeating that the CJ4Jet is estimated at $9 million. When the city spends $9 million, we build a public safety center for the whole community. So I think that those juxtapositions are really important to consider at this time.
Any other comments? All right, well, we have... Go ahead, Joel.
Okay, so I'm not sure where we want to go from here. I'm in forward of, or in favor of putting it on the agenda to approve. And there's some people that would not do that, and I understand that. So I don't know what the process is from here. I'll let you facilitate that.
Okay, I agree. I think that's where we're at, is that we need to move this to a business meeting under council action. Any objections to doing that? All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And we will move on to parking signage.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I have a very brief presentation for you today on downtown parking lot signage. And the subject in summary is simply to evaluate revised parking wayfinding signs and locations. And the relationship to your council goals are to maintain, operate, and expand our infrastructure to meet the community's needs. On September 28th, 2020, the most recent Parking Task Force report was presented to you, the City Council. The report made several recommendations regarding signage to make finding downtown parking lots much more effective. The previous parking lot signs were created and installed by the tourism contractor. Issues identified by the task force included fonts being too small, locations that were obscured, placement possibly too high, and a number of other issues. With transition of the tourism provider and transfer of property management division, who did work alongside them, to the Public Works division, Public Works is now reviewing those parking lot signs and is now ready to make a recommendation to you in order to improve their effectiveness. The Streets Division sign are making several recommendations, including some sign enhancements to align with the Parking Task Force, and 2 sample signs will be presented for your consideration. I want to back up just a little bit to the manual on uniform traffic control devices. This is the manual that guides everything we do in the roadways. Signage, cones, traffic control, you name it, is in this book. For parking area guide signs, the MUTCD recommends that parking signs be installed on major thoroughfares at the nearest point of access to the parking lot to get people to them quickly. And they should definitely not be more than 4 blocks away. The farther away they are from their actual parking lot tends to cause people to spend their time searching. So you want to make sure that your entrance is very clearly marked and have the sign immediately adjacent to that to make sure that people can get to them very easily. And MUTCD recommends that the signs be 30 by 24 inches with a giant P that is 5 times larger than the letter, should the word parking be on the sign. Again, these signs are a guide sign, and so the standards are much looser, and when you are including them as a wayfinding, the city has a lot of leeway with how that sign will appear in their jurisdiction. So the sign that's behind me now, this is a standard MUTCD parking sign that could be used, and those arrows, they come in rights and lefts and to give you different directional arrows. So this is parking sign number 1, which still maintains the wayfinding feel. It uses the universal P for parking. It will include a directional arrow, either right or left or straight, depending on where that parking is guiding them to. And it will be 24 by 36 inches in size. So this is the other example. These are very similar to the ones that were presented in the Parking Task Force report. This one uses letters that are slightly larger than 4 inches in height. Per MUTCD, that provides visibility up to 120 to 150 feet away, which is pretty significant. They also will include a directional arrow and also be 24 by 36 inches in height. So I included this in your presentation. There's also a link, and I believe you all can access that link from your home PCs of where our road signs actually are. These are the current parking lot signs. We are recommending that we take a look at those and reconfigure them based on staff recommendation. Almost all of those signs would remain. There are a few that are going to be relocated to be much more appropriate. Then there were a couple that will be eliminated that are too far away from the parking lots that they're trying to guide people to. So what are the cost implications? New sign blanks with printing would be roughly $165 each. Could be a little bit more. Material costs have really escalated in the last few years or since we purchased the last ones. We are estimating that they could get as high as $200 per sign if materials continue to escalate. We can refurbish the existing signs. So what that means is we can heat them up, peel off the letters from the existing surface. We do run a fairly high risk of damaging the coating, the vinyl coating that actually makes up the sign. And the amount of labor would take, we estimate that this would be close to $300 per sign. With 20 parking lot signs, we're estimating that that would be about $4,000 to replace those. There is funding available within Project LB 6282, which is the rebranding project that was instituted several years ago. There is approximately $31,000 remaining and can be used on this project. So we really have no call to action date. This is at your discretion. We would propose that staff replace the existing parking lot signs using our experience of where those signs should be located. If there are other signs that you feel aren't appropriately located, we would take that into consideration and relocate those. And right now, we just want to go out, get the new signs up, make sure that they're visible. As you can see from the 2 examples behind me, these are much, much more visible signs, and they'll look great in the downtown parking lot. And with that, I would take any questions that you have and also direction on which sign style, including, I did not bring an example of this, just a standard MUTCD sign. These would be much, much more inexpensive. I did not price them, however, but my guess is these are in the $100 a blank range.
Rick?
Thank you, Jason. I have 2 questions. One, would it be unprofessional if you took the existing signs and just put a vinyl overlay on top of it and not scrape it off?
We could look into that to see. It might be hard to get it to match up. You're talking about overlaying the entire sign. We could look into the cost of that.
Okay.
I don't know if it would adhere properly, though.
Okay. And then second question, are those signs behind you the proper size? They're 24 by 36, or are those three
They're,
quarters?
they're really, really, really close. When we scaled them up in the plotter, they're actually like 23 and a half by 35. So they didn't scale 100%, but they're really, really close.
So they wouldn't be any bigger than that,
A little bigger.
just half an inch?
Yeah,
Okay.
fractionally a little bit bigger.
Okay, so if you want to, I like the one with just the P and the arrow. That would be my vote. Thank you.
Rob?
So my first question, Jason, is I was kind of expecting to see the chairman of the parking task force here today.
I reached out
Where is he?
to him last week and let him know that the presentation was today, and I shot an email. I did not call him. I forgot to reach out late last week. I got super busy, but he said he would be here in my email last week.
Huh. Okay. I know that in the middle of last week, I guess I communicated with him, and he at that time thought he was waiting for a call from you or something, and I didn't realize that had not been nailed down.
Yeah, I told him when the presentation was, and I reached out again this morning and sent him a copy of the presentation, in fact.
Okay. So I'm pretty confident that I can speak pretty well on this subject. It's actually something that I've took an interest in and actually been working on for 7 years. In January, February of 2014, I actually got a petition of 70 downtown merchants together, and we were primarily talking about this exact subject. We also talked at that time about the fact that there was almost no way for a tourist to find a way into the Growers Market lot. The only way to get in that lot at that time was on F Street, F and 5th, and we suggested in our petition that they add the 4th Street driveway and that they make parking signs really clear and easy. And the main reason was not necessarily for the locals, but it was for the tourists. This was looked at as a tourism thing. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for tourists to have a positive experience from the moment they came in to the moment they left, to be able to find parking lots and not be frustrated. So I'd like to add, with that in mind, probably the most persuasive and powerful word in all of advertising is free. Okay? So since we have free parking, it would be really foolish for us not to brag about it. And you get a sense when somebody leaves Grants Pass, they'd be saying, oh yes, remember that town? That was great. The historic downtown, the jet boats, the vineyards. Remember all that free parking? You know, it was so easy to navigate. They were so welcoming. And to me, to not have that word free in on the parking is just like really, really, I'll use the word stupid. It would really be stupid. That's my opinion anyway, because it's such an asset. Because as we all know, most towns don't have it. So since we have it, we should be bragging about it at every opportunity. The other points that I would make is that because I look at this as much more than just parking, well, parking is very important, I look at this as basically tourism. I mean, we're going to be spending all this money to bring tourists here. The wayfinding signs are extremely important also, not just for the parking lots, but for the river and City Hall and the Performing Arts Center, the Downtown Welcome Center, the Uptown Welcome Center. And all of those signs were also done extraordinarily poorly. The 2-inch font is like a complete joke. Actually, I've got some pictures here that I'm going to just distribute. Send a couple packs around. This is basically just the need, to demonstrate the need for, they're all, I think, separate. Thank you. And this was in the Parking Task Force report. I'm sorry. I think I have enough for everybody. I don't know. So I'm pretty confident quite now at this point, since it's in your hands, and I know that you're very competent in a lot of different areas. I'm pretty confident that you'll have the size of the font, the clarity, all that stuff. I'm sure you'll get the mechanics down. There's, you know, we were, you know, told in the past that it was the tourism guy, but also it was two city staff people, along with the tourism guy, that created the signs that we have now that are basically, they're of no value whatsoever. They're actually dangerous, quite frankly, because you can't read them when you're driving at a normal speed. I know that you're going to get that part right. The question I have is that, you know, we talk, I guess in the packet it says 18 to 20 signs or something like that. I know in the parking task force, we went over this list, which was about 40 of these signs, and they included wayfinding signs all over town. And there's also a tremendous amount of inconsistency in our programs. Some of the signs that are on 6th Street are done well, and others that are on 7th Street for the same exact attraction are done poorly, and vice versa. So, you know, it's almost comical, really. Then we have, of course, duplication up at, 7th and Morgan. There's a sign that says Info Center, probably 6-inch font, white letters, blue background, good sign. Right above it is the wayfinding sign that's basically worthless. Obviously, we don't need to replace that one. Because that
Counselor
one-
Pell, we're working on making sign improvements. Is there,
Okay. So the question I have is, yeah, and I don't need to be pushed. The question I have is, you decided on 18 to 20 signs, when in fact we've got 40 out there that aren't doing the job.
Yep.
And you're looking at it more as a parking thing. I'm looking at it as a parking for tourists, but also to help tourists get around town. So is there any particular reason why you decided not to do the other 20 some odd signs?
Yeah, absolutely. So Public Works is responsible now with all of the departmental move for the parking lots. The parking lot signs were ones that we could get done and make effective very, very quickly. I think the wayfinding signs are going to need a lot more work. Not only are they going to be a challenge because of the number of letters in some of the items and the size of the sign, I just think that that's a much longer project than just trying to get the parking lot signs done. So we did not include those in our tally. We just focused on the parking lots.
Yeah, I mean, when you mention the letters, I mean, some of them are just so silly. They say Josephine County Community Library rather than just public library. I mean, it's just, some of the decisions are just really ridiculous. But I know that you're going to get the mechanical part of this down. There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I think that I would like to see 1 or 2 meetings of an ad hoc committee that would include you and possibly someone from tourism and possibly someone from the council, just to go over what your plans are. And the only reason I'm saying this is that it was done so poorly over the last 7 years. You know, this was just for the reason that it was brought up at this parking task force is because the first thing we did was look over what hadn't been accomplished from the last parking task force. So the merchants first brought this up in 2014, the parking task force after that in 14, parking task force this year. So I just would feel a lot better if we had a 1 or 2 meetings of an ad hoc committee that would meet with you and make sure that this is going in the right direction. I would also like to say that I think that the word free should be used whenever it's got anything to do with the parking lots because it's an asset, it's a plus for tourists, it's something they might remember, and I think that free should be included in all of them. I also have to wonder if people are already in Grants Pass. Is it really important to use up valuable space on the sign on the words Grants Pass? They already know, everybody knows where they are. They got off the Grants Pass exit. So I have to wonder about that. Also, any of the signs that are in the historic district, I don't know if you considered this, but statewide standards are white letter on brown background. And I'm just wondering if any of the signs that are in the historic district should include possibly the top could be where it says Grants Pass now, maybe it would say Historic District, white on brown, or something like that. But I don't know if you consider, we'll say, the marketing or the tourism aspect of it, rather than, the imparting information is number one, but I'm just wondering, there's a few different aspects of it. I'm just wondering if, because that's not really your area of expertise as the Public Works guy. So I'm just wondering if there should be some signs that, it doesn't seem like there's any consideration for signs that indicate people are in the historic district. I also think that the word free is absolutely critical. And I appreciate you wanting to get it done quickly. And I think that if we had 1 or 2 meetings of an ad hoc committee, it wouldn't delay it too much. And with that, I'll...
Rob, As far as the free public parking sign goes, do you like the free public parking sign over the big P
Over the big, oh, instead of.
instead of, yes?
I absolutely do. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things
Okay.
I handed out. That was a mock-up that the Parking Task Force came up with as a suggestion, and we did discuss that at length.
Okay, thank you. I think
yeah.
that's relevant for today. I agree with you. I've not been a fan of the signs in general, and we probably have more issues to talk about for another day. It's not Mr. Kennedy's decision on whether or not we have an ad hoc committee. So at this time, let's ask him any questions that we have, and then we can go into council discussion. Rick?
Jason, can't we keep the discussion on two separate issues? One, the parking issue, because I think the tourism season is upon us, and to get that resolved. And I don't have any problem with free public parking or the P, but I guess I would like to see us move forward with that. And then for the tourism committee and other relevant committees to then look at the wayfinding signs and decide what they want to do with that. So we don't need to have to slow the process down. Would that be possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Other questions about the parking? Rob?
So, Jason, I don't know if you saw you probably saw at some point the
Yes.
Parking Task Force. And if the members of the council want to look at page 13, we have two signs that look like the carved, on carved wood, where it says public parking. And they actually probably are our two best signs in the historic district as far as parking goes, because they're visible from so far away. And have you considered any signs of that style? Because those are extremely effective from a great distance away driving, and they would have historic kind of nature to them. Have you considered those? I don't know if you're familiar with
No,
which ones
I
I'm
know the
talking about.
signs that you're talking about. They're like hanging on the inside of the parking lots.
Exactly.
No, we have not.
7th and G.
We strictly looked at the report and kind of followed along with trying to maintain the same guidelines as the wayfinding signs, to make them fit to where they weren't that much different, but clear that they were guiding folks to parking lots, the free public parking lots, excuse me.
Thank you.
Jason, are these signs, the 24 by 36, is that larger than the existing signs?
No, they are the same size.
Same size. And then as far as signs at the lot goes, because that's been one issue, we have, some very nice signs that say Redwood and Grasshopper and things like that, but they don't actually really clearly say parking. Is there a plan for that?
There is. We're actually looking to see if we can get new top notches made. They have a custom top with a P on it, but it does blend in. We're also working with the urban forester to trim. Several of them are obscured by trees, as well as several of the parking signs are obscured by trees, and we're working with Tony Makem on how to ensure that those stay clear. And as I said, we're looking to see if we can get a custom top made for those posts that make it a little bit more distinct. That blue P on the top of the post with the redwood on it, or whatever the parking lot name, it does tend to disappear.
Okay, is there other council questions? Valerie?
Yeah, I just have a question. Are there flags at the parking lots as well?
I don't
Are there?
believe so.
No, okay. I just had a vision of a parking lot that had a big blue flag kind of that was going up the sign, so maybe I'm just imagining things.
Like a banner?
Like a banner.
It's a good idea. I don't think we have parking banners, though, that I'm
We don't.
familiar with. but-
Okay.
Okay, so today you're looking for a kind of council consensus on whether or not we prefer the P versus the free public parking. I've heard from two people, and just like my kids, one of them said one thing and one said the other. So how do the rest of you feel about it? Joel?
I'm not sure if I'm the youngest kid or the oldest kid. Hopefully I'm the youngest. I think at this point in time, it's ripe to make a decision so that we get some signs out there in the free public parking is what I would like. During implementation, if there's some review with some of our stakeholders, I'm not against that. And then if there's some additional signs in the future that need to be done, we can address that in a timely manner. So one of the things I think is the council makes the decision and the administration implements that. And during that implementation, if there's some coordination with the user groups, there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm ready to make a decision on the signs that are presented before us, and I would go for the free public parking.
Thank you. Vanessa?
I'm also in favor of the free public parking.
Thank you. Valerie?
I'm also in favor of the free public parking.
Kurt?
All right, I don't want to be the difficult one, but I think the P is very visible. And I think that, my experience driving around Portland looking for parking is always just trying to find it. And then if I was to get there and see it's free, I'd just say, cool. And to me, they're going to be parking. They're not going to walk around and see a P and decide to just take off because it's not free. They're going to find out it's free and they're going to be happy. So I would opt for the P.
Thank you. I think that leaves you, Brian.
I'm kind of on the fence. I see both sides, and I think that they will both be more effective than what we have now.
That's true. I have one question. Is there any opportunity to put a smaller thing underneath that, like if we went with the big P, that we could have a small horizontal sign underneath that said free parking or something like that? I know these
We'd
verticals.
have to look at each location. A lot of these are really limited by height. When they're really close to the sidewalk, we have to maintain that they're tall enough that people are getting under. Also that they are back far enough from the roadway. We've had several, where they kind of encroach out into the traffic, and diesel trucks, if they're hugging that lane, will clip them. But there might be an opportunity if we went with just the P, that they could have an auxiliary sign below or above that said free parking.
Okay, one other question. Is there an opportunity to just put one out quickly and we can all see if we hate it before you go to the trouble of doing 20 of them?
Absolutely, we could do that.
In that sense, I think we've heard a preference for free public parking. Let's do a trial ASAP, and then we'll see if anyone objects before we go.
I'll get that out, and we'll get a location to Aaron so he can get it distributed to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question.
Yep, go for it, Rob.
So how far away would you expect drivers to be able to see these signs from?
So MUTCD says that with 4-inch letters, which is what are on this sign here, and they're actually a little bit larger than 4 inches because of the way the spacing worked out, visibility is very good at 120 to 150 feet, which is fairly significant.
So if we're going to look at one of those signs, then we should be looking at them from 100 feet or more away. So that we should be judging it from 100 feet or more.
Yep. Or as you drive around and where does it pop out at you? Because it could be much more than that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, conditional use permits for social services.
Good morning. A topic that you have seen before, social services facilities. This is a follow-up to a March workshop where the council asked for staff to come back with a little bit more detail on what exactly would go into a code amendment related to social services facilities. So that is the subject here, to continue that discussion and talk about some new definitions that might go in the code, to talk about some zoning classifications of where these would go. The relationship to council goals is there to provide cooperative shared leadership involving council staff and community, and to facilitate sustainable and manageable growth. So as mentioned, and I may, since I saw that we have 40 minutes designated for this one, jump a little bit on some of these slides and not hit all of them to what I think are the more salient points, just in part because I know that we have had this conversation at a broad level a couple of different times. But this is the fifth conversation on this topic. The council has kind of started moving us in the direction of focusing social services in more than just the business park and industrial zones, which is where they are currently located. The council also at the last meeting in March requested a little bit of background, and I did not include that in the PowerPoint, but the memo that we sent for today's meeting does have it. About what was in the code prior to 2015. The current code that we have was triggered in large part with some social service facility, the soup kitchen at St. Vincent de Paul down there near 7th and M Street, which was serving breakfast and lunch, and there was some complaints filed with public safety prior to that time about loitering and other things happening, kind of especially around that period until lunch. And so the code at that point was changed to remove social service facilities from the central business district. As I put in the memo, it actually just really wasn't defined very well, and that 2015 amendment added social service facilities and transient quarters, basically combining those together. But as I mentioned, the memo goes into a little bit more detail. That really was the trigger. Prior to that point, transient quarters was the only term used in the code. It was always only allowed in the business park and industrial zones. So it was never listed outright in the general commercial, which you'll see today is one of the zones we're being proposed to expand it to. At the March workshop, we talked about option one, is what we called it, and that was recommended that staff come back with kind of a little bit more detail on that particular option, and that's breaking that category, social service facility, transient quarters, into 4 different uses. So today we're going to just kind of go into a little bit of detail on the code, development code sections that would be affected by this change. So the first section is edits in Article 30. Doesn't make sense numerically, but it kind of makes sense in terms of defining, knowing what we're talking about before we go into the other articles. So we'll talk about those definitions and what those are. And what is a little bit new here is this term special use permit. The more we looked into this, a conditional use permit is what's been shown on the council agenda to this point. That is a permit that currently has quite a bit of detail in Article 16, I believe, and it's very specific, has a lot of detail about going to the Urban Planning Commission and a lot of findings that are required for the conditional use permit. The council has given direction that you would want to see the majority of these social services facilities come directly to you and not go to the Planning Commission. So basically what the special use permit is attempting to do is recognize that you want to see these first and they wouldn't go to the Planning Commission, and also that there was some conversation about revocation of a permit, about review of a permit. You really can't do that unless you have an actual permit. So this is basically discretionary review in the planning lingo. The administrative review is another option, and that would basically be an allowed use, which is what the majority of business uses in the general commercial zone are administrative review. So they come in, it's strictly at staff level, there is no public hearing, there's no really discretionary review, as long as they meet the criteria that are specifically outlined in the code. So those are really the reasons for that special use permit. we can talk more about that as council wants. So it's staff's understanding that council wants all shelter-related permits to be submitted directly to you. As I just mentioned, creating the SUP separate from the CUP does allow for this difference. So those are a couple of new definitions that would be added into Article 30. We'll also talk about Article 12 changes and Article 14 changes. So some of the new definitions in Article 30, and I just wanted to jump to the second bullet in this one. Goods and services which may be provided to include but are not limited to food, healthcare, clothing, warming centers. So this, near the Foundry and Booth area, there's several of these already in town. So this category, there's no housing involved. It's, you know, where folks would come to the facility. It's more of a kind of during the daytime only hours. Typically provided nonprofit agencies, you know, charitable organizations, government agencies. This kind of use arguably has some less impact and could potentially be pulled out from discretionary review so that you would only have this one as a permitted use. That's a thought that I had actually after we did this. I just wanted to put that on the table. So as it's before you today, a basic need facility would have a special use permit, but I think there's some good arguments to be made that if you put enough standards, they could just be administrative and not require that special use permit. But again, this is all development code language that we're talking about. We have the authority at the, here at the city council level to give direction for these changes. These are not coming through the state of Oregon per se, like some of the other definitions. So the second definition that would be added, that would be new to Article 30 is shelter, facility, or site. So this would be a land use to provide temporary shelter for unhoused persons. This could include emergency shelter in response to disaster events or severe weather events. We talked before about some of the confusion of the terms transitional shelter and temporary shelter. So the objective here with this definition was to just focus in on temporary shelter for unhoused persons. This could include tents, it could include camp trailers, it could include even a building, but where food service medical aid is there. Currently, the definition also adds that sanitation and security must be provided. We already talked about this would be another new term that would be put into Article 30, special use permit. Another new term, supportive housing type A. So we've got supportive housing type A and B. Really the primary difference here is the type A is your Foundry Village kind of example, where the user is going through the 2017 Oregon Transitional Housing Code and not the Oregon Structural Code. So this would allow for that short term. They could even be moved around, but you would also see them have some on-site, often some kind of on-site service there that's available. The type B, supportive housing type B, is the one that would be subject to the specialty code. More permanent housing, again, sanitation and security being provided. The expectation is that the client population would eventually move on to longer term housing, but you could see tenants here for a year or more. The same tenants at a location that has called supportive housing type B. Supportive services would also be a new term, and this is getting to what are the types of services that are provided at a supportive housing facility. And these are kind of the full range. This isn't a restrictive list, but just kind of give some examples there of employment assistant, counseling, on-site medical aid. Services at a minimum would provide basic needs, but may include more extensive and complex services. So that would, again, be a new definition there. So what would be stricken in Article 30 would be social services, facility transient quarters, and transient quarters. Those are both two current definitions. They would be stricken. So then we get into Article 12, which is where can these be placed? And this is the more traditional zoning section of the code. Supportive housing type A and B, we have a residential section in Article 12 and a services section. So we would put the supportive housing type A and B in the residential, and we would put the basic needs facility and shelter facility under the services subsection. And an example of what that looks like was attached to the memo. The matrix was an exhibit to the memo, and that kind of shows you graphically, you know, what this would look like.
Sarah, can I ask a question, please? I was just wondering, this is like some pretty meaty stuff we're dealing with here, and I had some questions about the Article 30 that I kind of wanted to understand before we went to the next section. So I just wanted to get clarification on the different types, just so I know exactly what they mean. And so, for example, I'm just kind of looking for an example of each, like a shelter facility or site. Would that be something like an urban campground or like a urban car camp or something like that?
Correct.
Okay. And then supportive housing type A, you said, would be similar to a Foundry Village. Type B would be a more permanent shelter, similar to what was proposed at Manzanita, I'm assuming.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Good
And
example.
then the slide after that has supportive services. I wasn't totally clear on if that's like a...
Sure. So we're talking about just the definitions, because in the body of the code, we would refer to supportive services, not as a standalone land use, but as a description of what kinds of services would go with the supportive housing. So just simply because we use the term in the body of the code, we're just talking about, we want to make sure that it's clear what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on?
Sorry, I agree with you. It's pretty dense stuff, but trying to move through it as thorough, but also in as simple a way as possible here.
Rob has a question.
So
And
on the
Valerie.
supportive services, those would always be combined with supportive housing type A or B, or would that also be standalone supportive services that don't necessarily that aren't in the same property as the housing?
I think you could potentially see them as standalone. I think in the context of what we're talking about here, the intent was that it was to be descriptive of what kind of supportive services we're talking about that would actually be on location with supportive housing. But the truth is, if you look at that, that definition of basic needs facility, the second bullet there, this is slide 8, goods and services which may be provided include but are not limited to food, healthcare, clothing, warming center, technical assistance. So there's a lot of that supportive services that's included in that basic needs facility, but the purpose in putting it into Article 30 was to be clear that if you came in with a supportive housing application to the city and you said we're going to propose to put a type A here and we're going to have supportive services, we're trying to be a little more clear about what that is. So it's really almost accessory to the main housing piece. as compared to, you know, the entire site being used for, you know, technical assistance or for employment assistance or something like that.
I guess the concern or the question that I have is when we listen to the Medford people talk about the lessons they learned over there was, you know, at a supportive housing type A or B, it would be people that have been pre-approved, qualified, et cetera, and may not necessarily be coming and going or hanging out during the day. So they create one kind of impact potentially on a community. And then the supportive services people, you know, that can create a completely different kind of impact on a community. People that would go, you know, for services during the day, but haven't necessarily been pre-screened or whatever. And I kind of look at that being a big distinction, but I don't know that there is would be a big distinction as to where they could be placed with the way that you're describing it. So my concern is that, you know, one is the kind of thing that you can really help guarantee or ensure that is low impact to the community, where you can take as much, you know, you can do as much prevention as possible for that. And the other could have a lot of impact, you know, on the surrounding neighborhood. So, but they seem to me to be kind of tied together the way that you've written it up so far.
Sure. Well, I mean, again, we're kind of at that brainstorming stage here. So I think this certainly is not in stone. So if that's a direction you want us to take, we take this back and rework it. We're happy to do that.
I think on that note, the way I'm reading this is that a basic needs facility under slide 8 would be that kind of walk-in, get services facility, and supportive services as defined on page 13 is services that are available in conjunction with the housing. Is that what your intent?
That was the intent, yes. And there's, you know, it's not uncommon, particularly maybe more at the permanent type, how the supportive services be. And we have a couple of examples already here in town where the tenants have, you know, there's another office right there on the property where they can, you know, go during the day to meet with a counselor or, you know, help out fill out employment applications or whatever. So, but they're really intended to help the people that already reside there, as compared to open to, you know, the general public.
Valerie, did you have a question?
Well, my question was a little different, and I would agree with you. I kind of saw the supportive services as an undercurrent, just defining what had been stated in supportive housing per se. But anyway, this is a lot of stuff. You're right, Brian. This is heavy stuff. My question kind of goes back to, and I don't know if this is the time to ask this, about the appeals. As it is, if you take something to the Urban Area Planning Commission, it can be appealed to the council. But if it comes directly to us and they appeal it, do they appeal it to LUBA? Is that what it would automatically be appeal up there? Because doesn't there have to be an appeal process? Sure. So I just wanted a clarification on that. So if anything we move to having it come before us, we recognize that if somebody is going to appeal it, it would have to be appealed up to LUBA.
Right, and maybe Mark wants to have
That's correct, but even if something is appealable from the UAPC to the city council, that can then be appealed to LUBA as well.
Right.
So it's not like if you have UAPC as an actual decision maker subject to appeal, then that alleviates the possibility or the need to eventually appeal to LUBA. All roads lead to LUBA when it's a land use decision.
Yes, and I knew that, but I just wanted to say that I just wanted a clarification that if we don't do the urban area planning, that also doesn't give us any option there. They know the next step would automatically be to LUBA.
I think, Councilor, you're touching on a really good point. It is truly policy that you're talking about here, and so then really you're talking about the process of that policy. And at what level do you incorporate public comment and what process you want to have in that? and whether or not it starts with the UAPC before it goes to you, or if you want it to go directly to you. That is, I think, a big point in this when you're talking about process for this type of activity.
Thank you. Let's hop back to, what, slide 15?
Yes. Is that the one?
Article
My
12.
numbers are a little different.
You may have been a 14. Okay, 17, page 17 for us.
Yes, there we go. So this Article 14 is kind of getting to the more procedural kind of stuff, certain uses, and it would add a special use permit and basically explain in the code what's involved, with a special use permit, that you would have a pre-application conference. That's with staff level. It may require a site plan review. We put may because if you're coming into an existing facility and you're not changing anything in terms of parking, you're not changing anything with landscaping, you're not changing anything with the fenced-in areas, we wouldn't require a site plan review for that if the only change is the change of use. And then after staff has determined that the application meets the minimum requirements, then it would be scheduled for a public hearing before the City Council. And the criteria used by the City Council to determine if the application would be approved and the types of conditions would be placed, those would include things like this: submitting a development and operations plan, submitting an applicant operator qualification certification. They have to be deemed in compliance with relevant city codes and statutes, and that could be expanded a little bit, but that's, things like, do they have other required certifications? We would have to check that before they even get through, this first review process. Some of the other things that could apply here, what's here in this draft is a 3-year permit term. That would be renewable. Again, what's before you is a proposal. There's pros and cons to doing 2-year. If you don't do a permit, you wouldn't have the option to do a term. And I think that's the reason for the special use permit, as we took the guidance from council at the last couple of meetings. But we put 3 years there and there right now. The city manager could authorize a one-time extension of 3 years, giving them basically 6 years to operate. And that permit extension, if you want to go beyond that, or if you were going to see an increase in persons served of more than 10%, and we chose that just because that's a fairly consistent measurement that's already in the code, that would require a new public hearing before the council. Special use permit could be revoked by council with a 15-day notice upon a demonstration that the permit holder has failed to comply with the conditions of approval. And that could be revoked at any time by the city manager upon demonstration of immediate threat to public health or safety. A permit for a shelter facility, a shelter facility or site would require compliance with the Oregon State Fire Marshal's technical advisory, and that gets into really more of the fire code kinds of issues. If you don't have fire suppression system, for example, you would have to have a fire watch, things like that. And having biannual reviews by the city on these.
Brad, do you mean twice a year with biannual? Or every other year?
No, that would be every other, yeah.
Okay.
Semi-annual versus biannual, I've always been confused on that. But biannual would be every other year. These slides were shown in March, just to give you a sense for where the general commercial zone properties are. It's all of the red colored property here, really. This would be the newer eligible areas. The purples and the blues are where they are already existing allowed. The social services are allowed today. So 1,187 acres is what we have currently zoned for general commercial land in the city. So there's that stretch along the north, and then here's the stretch along the south that runs more or less along Red River Highway and Highway 199. So again, having the cost implication is really more administrative than preparing the code, and we're still looking at council discretion on whether you want us to take this or incorporate more of your comments and take this to a public hearing before the Planning Commission, or if you want to see another workshop, kind of open to more guidance from you.
Brian, then Valerie.
Thank you, Brad. I can tell you and the department have put a lot of work into this, and I appreciate that. On those maps that you just had up there, could you explain the other colors, like the orange and the yellow, and just for future reference, having a legend might be nice on these maps in the future, but I'm just curious what those other colors are.
Yeah, legends are always good. I tell staff that too. So the yellow, all the yellow colors are residential zones. They're just different types of residential zones. And let me just go back here to this, which I may have skipped over this one pretty quick, and I apologize if I did that. But so this slide here, we're in the second column is where we're calling out where each of the 4 land uses could be permitted.
Okay. Yeah.
So you'll see the general commercial actually listed for all of them. But there is on the supportive housing type B, R2, R3, and R4 listed. So those R zones would incorporate some of those yellow areas. Those are the more higher density zones. We do have some single-family subdivisions. Actually, we have single-family subdivisions in general commercial too. Yeah, so that's really, other than this fuchsia color, that's a central business district zone right here in the middle of the map. And then, yeah, as you go down E and F Street, you have quite a bit of the industrial and the business park down that way. But you get in, to the R18s and R16s. A lot of that is over here in the northeast. R112s over here, some in the northwest. So that's most of what those colors are.
Okay, yeah, you kind of sniffed out my question there on the supportive housing type B with the R2, 3, and 4. I think it'd be helpful, at least for me, to see visually what locations that type would be permitted in, just whether it's in an email or something after the fact.
You bet.
Valerie, then Rick.
Actually, I think you pretty much answered my question. That was my question, was the chart on the supportive A, supportive B, which one was able to be into the residential area. I do know that there are currently, and I know in my own neighborhood, there are several care facilities that are in the actual neighborhood that have absolutely been no problem. So I just was curious as to what residential areas were opening up for, whether it was just the supportive A or supportive B. So I think my question was answered. It's a supportive B, correct?
Right. Yes, and assisted care, assisted living, those are permitted in the R2, R3 as well.
Rick?
Brad, could you go back to the slide with the zoning districts? So where it's listed GC for all of those, as we look at other cities that have done similar programs, and I'm not asking for an answer today, but for instance, has Eugene, Portland, and what other cities, how have they categorized and allocated their designations? And I believe Medford currently is in the GC for most of their uses.
Yeah, the Kelly shelter is actually, I think they're downtown, whatever their equivalent to Central Business District zoning is. So they have that as well as an allowed zone. But yes, the common to see the general commercial being used.
So I think that'd be helpful to know what other cities have done. Thank you.
Other questions? Joel?
So Brad, I applaud you for your homework, and I applaud all our council people for their concern and for their fellow human beings. There's a part of me that we're treating only the symptoms, not the cause. And that's because the cause is bigger than Grants Pass. And this isn't going to solve it. This is not going to solve the problem. I kind of feel like it's going to help some individual people, I hope, that, that's worthwhile. I kind of feel like China during the opiate wars, where they finally went to war to keep the Western industrial powers from trading opium with their people because it was destroying their social network. And I kind of feel like our social structure, the opposite of the airport situation, where it would build a sense of community, that nationwide we're having a destruction of our social community. And I applaud us for taking on some of the symptoms of that, but I'm also realistic it's not going to solve that. I'd also encourage us all to exercise our free will to make good choices, and to encourage others to do the same, and to become heroes. Move beyond Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're not robots. We don't just respond to stimulus, but we actually think and care for each other. Heroes are willing to give up their lives for other people. Maslow's hierarchy of needs does not account for that. The other extreme that doesn't account for it in Maslow's hierarchy of needs is you help somebody and they spit in your face, which we've all experienced. So I'm a little frustrated because we're only treating the symptoms, not the cause, and I applaud us for our efforts.
Thank you. Any questions for Brad? Vanessa?
This may have been asked earlier in a different phrase, so forgive me if it has, but is there an intentional reason that under supportive housing type A and supportive housing type B, the clause where a full range of supported services are provided, why that exact clause isn't along with the other two newly created definitions?
Which phrase is that again?
Under supportive housing type A and type B, the first bullet point, the second portion of that states where a full range of supported services are provided. And it designates the type of housing beforehand. Is there a reason why that wasn't included with the other two new definitions? Just because it kind of says that any type of supportive service may be provided here based on the needs of the folks coming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, for the basic needs facility, it would not really be applicable. So I think that's probably why it wasn't included in that one. There was not a reason for the shelter facility or site why that wasn't included, no.
Okay. My concern for this is that it kind of leaves it open to interpretation for the service providers as to what folks need that are, at that site for help, whatever that help may look like. So I think that may leave that opportunity open to them to decide. And under the basic needs facility or site, I would like to see the second bullet point. I would like to see the verbiage change from "and other social services" to "and other supportive services," so that it stays within that code definition there. As well, I have one more to throw at you.
Okay.
Under the supportive services definition, I would like a clause, as you stated earlier, that it's not a restrictive list. Thank
Sure.
you.
You bet.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you. I support what Councilor Ogier just said, specifically with adding the supportive services language to the shelter facility category. I think it's just as important in that category as it is in the other housing categories.
Okay?
Valerie?
Just a change that I think is important is I don't think that in the beginning one, the first one, the basic needs, facilities, or site, I don't think that needs to be, as you mentioned earlier, a special use. Because you can look at a million thrift stores and all those things, and basically they're all going to fall under that. And if every one of those had to come before the council, they're there now. It just seems like that shouldn't have to come before the council. And that's just my input.
Brian?
I would second that, Valerie.
What page was that on?
Slide 8. Yeah, and to be clear, if they're already existing, like the ones on Booth Street, obviously they're grandfathered in, so they're not going to have to do a special use permit or anything like that.
And there are several on 6th and 7th. I mean, we have, they're all over. So I just kind of feel like, that's just something we've just accepted as that's just part of, when we have services like that. It just should go the regular. So it seems really crazy to bring every one of those services up to the council level. That's just my thought.
Vanessa?
Counselor Lovelace, I'm not understanding that. Do you mean like the St. Vincent Mobile Kitchen, or you mentioned thrift stores? I'm not understanding that correlation.
I'm just talking about there's thrift stores. I mean, any of those basic needs right now, they're all over this city, and they haven't. I just see if another one wants to open or whatever. I just think that if it's just a basic needs of a daytime thing, like any business, it's not an overnight shelter, it's nothing to that effect. But I just kind of feel like if it's just a day operation, it shouldn't have to rise to come before the council. That's my thought. For planning,
I think the history behind that is the 2015 decision around the St. Vincent Mobile Kitchen. I think that may be why that's grouped in here.
And that could be, but I do think that they found other ways to make that work. So maybe I'm.
I understand. Thank you.
Other questions? All righty. Thank you,
you.
Brad. All right. Discussion, comments on what we want to do with this? Aaron, do you have something?
Going to do exactly what I was going to do. I've got a lot of notes here on special information to report back to, et cetera, but with only 1 or 2 council members mentioning. So if we can get maybe some general guidelines on what was just discussed, if everyone had no objections to what everyone said, then we'll compile everything and make all those changes, or maybe we need to go through and get some additional direction.
Okay. Does anybody else have thoughts to share? Looking like no, so we'll just take Valerie?
I will just say that I was supportive of Vanessa when she said add this support, and Brian adding the supportive services as opposed to social services so it was consistent throughout, if that helps, on the basic needs facilities service site.
Brian?
Yeah, I just have a question about how we're going to proceed from here, because I feel like most of it's kind of, good, and there's some tweaks. So are we going to move it to a business meeting, have another workshop, or?
I kind of feel like we're probably at another workshop myself. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, if everyone was in agreement with what everyone said today, I think we have enough information. We could put it to a business meeting for potential deliberation, discussion, and adoption.
I'm wondering, so on the call to action, it says that one of the possibilities is to move the text amendment to the UAPC. So would you have it go to the council meeting first and then after council approves, it goes to UAPC?
No, we'd want to send it to UAPC first, and we could do that if you wanted to. We could take the comments from today's meeting, we can incorporate that now into, and make those changes and make a presentation to UAPC for their recommendation to you.
Okay, are we ready for that, or do we want to see this one more time before it goes off to UAPC? Valerie?
Well, I would like to see it go off to UAPC because I do respect UAPC and their ability to look at things and give us recommendations, further recommendations. I do know that as we move forward, you know, urban campground, nothing can happen until this gets worked out. So that's why I'm willing to move forward and send it to the UAPC and through the system to come back to us.
Brian?
Yeah, I would second that, making those adjustments, sending it to UAPC so we can keep moving it forward.
Okay, is everyone on board with that plan? I'm seeing 3 nods over here and 4 hands over here. Yes, okay. Next up, Parklet program. And congrats to Brad for staying pretty much on time there.
Great, Mayor and Council, I'll see if I can also keep us on time. This will be a joint presentation between Brad and myself on the downtown parklets. And the subject and summary is to evaluate long-term parklet infrastructure, including aesthetics, cost, and ownership. And the relationship to your council goals are encouraging economic opportunities and then maintain and expand our infrastructure. So as you recall, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, City Council directed staff to work with interested businesses to install temporary parklets, which we did last summer. The city contracted at that time with Copeland Sand and Gravel, as well as Riverside Ready Mix, to place concrete barriers at several restaurant locations along city-owned streets. We also purchased plastic barricades and constructed temporary ADA ramps for restaurants that were on ODOT 6th Street, allowing these restaurants to utilize the full sidewalk for on-street dining. So those parklets were removed in early November 2020, coinciding with the winter season. However, at the request of many downtown restaurants, City Council directed staff to reinstall the parklets in early March of 21. Concrete barriers were then placed to construct parklets along the city-owned streets again. City staff finished installing wooden parklets along ODOT 6th Street right-of-way last week. But at that time, you also requested that we look into a long-term proposal for either seasonal or permanent parklets, and so that's why we're coming back today. So some of the requirements that we have to take into consideration is ODOT. Their right-of-way is on 6th and 7th Street, and they will have full control over what we are allowed to do. They may not allow this as a permanent use, even if it is seasonal. They may allow it, though, however. ODOT does not allow commerce to be conducted in their right-of-way on the drivable surfaces. So that is why we've had to route the pedestrians onto the street in those locations, why we can't move the tables out there because they're actually doing commerce. I will say that city staff did an amazing job this year of creating pedestrian detours. If you've seen those, they turned out incredible. And I just want to give a shout out to our streets group who did that work. They turned out really, really nice. We're quite proud of those. And there's a couple of views of them that you can see. So still on G Street, we have the concrete barriers. We installed those to protect the dining customers because as we're aware, those diners are actually sitting down in the roadway. We feel that a higher level of safety is needed because the diners are now seated in that area right adjacent to the traffic, whereas pedestrians, their exposure is pretty limited. They're walking through that area, they're not there very long. The likelihood of something happening and getting hit is very small. So under this program, the city did permit the sidewalk cafes to extend into the right-of-way and maintained ADA compliant pathway through the center of that. So there's a couple of categories when we started doing some research on this. The first is the dining space in the roadway. This adds about 6 feet of dining space. It's kind of that parking width. However, it does increase the patron's exposure to traffic within the roadway, which means that we may want to permanently consider some sturdier safeguards. So instead of a plastic barricade, we maintain those concrete barricades out there. It also increases the pedestrian and business staff conflicts potential, as pedestrians are walking through on the sidewalk while the restaurant people are trying to get to and from their customers, which are in the roadway. The other item that this is a little bit different is patrons are, in our current installation, stepping on and off of the curb to reach that seated area. That does pose a potential risk just because of the uneven surfaces. Now, we could build platforms out in that area, which would keep that surface level. That was just a fair amount of extra cost, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, and so we did not do that. But it may be if we're going to do permanent parklets in that area, we will want to consider that. The parklets that are out there now are very low cost. We can easily put out concrete barricades, and the property owners can do the decorating. So the other kind of parklet category is detouring the pedestrians. This reduces the conflicts between the business staff and those pedestrians. Businesses can use the entire sidewalks, which may not drastically increase potential tables, but it may also in certain areas. It also, because of the pedestrians are walking through there, we already touched on this a little bit, it decreases their exposure to the traffic. They're also going to be a little bit smaller, more attractive barricades, traffic barricades. We could do a handrail as opposed to a giant concrete block which is sitting out there. There's a lot more opportunity to make something that's more attractive to the people. However, these are a much more expensive installation. It takes quite a bit more work to get those in there and keep them ADA compliant. And I believe we're coming up. So cities throughout the country have been working on this problem, not necessarily problem, opportunity. We have been working on this opportunity. Nobody's found the silver bullet. But there are quite a few opportunities and general plans that give us an idea of what can be done. The plans generally include that the business owners are actually the constructor in most cities. They procure the contractor, they perform the maintenance, and it's their parklet, which is a little bit different than what we have been doing. If we want to look at this long term, we may look at pushing that back to the business owners who want those parklets. Business owners have also been I'm going to get the words wrong, naming the city as an additionally insured. So as they have people out there dining against the roadway, they have said, yeah, we acknowledge that there might be a little higher risk. City, you are absolved of liability for that. They also, in some cities, pay rental fees for the parking spaces that they are taking up while they are using these parklets. And then how it normally had been working in most cities, the city reviews and accepts a design, just like a similar, like any building or permitting process, and then the business owner builds that parklet and operates it. I did bring you guys 2 parklet design guides. One of these is from the city of Salt Lake City and the other from the city of Milwaukee. Both of these were really good documents. I just thought you may want to review those if we were to move forward with a permanent program. I'm sure we'll work with planning to rely pretty heavily on documents such as these to move the program forward. And then I just wanted to show a couple of the neater ideas that we've seen out there. This one actually is one that they would actually load on a trailer as is. You're able to just lift that up, set it on the back of a trailer, drive it away. Here's some other ideas of where they have extended the sidewalk out into the public area or into the parking area. Done a fairly permanent installation here with that arbor above, but it does look very attractive. A smaller dining one, and also another small dining area. Yeah, not quite as attractive, but very inexpensive to purchase and install.
Thanks for showing us a ridiculously ugly option, Jason.
I know. I got to show them all. So I did want to talk about costs. Concrete barriers. We get these at a very, very low price from a local business. They are actually still owned and installed by local contractors. The city does not rent the barriers. This has been costing us about $200 per parklet to get those placed and removed. Very cost effective. As you recall from last year, we also received numerous complaints about how they looked, that they were kind of bulky. But if we were looking at the absolute low cost option, this is it. They currently installed pedestrian detours. These are the ones that we just finished up downtown. We're about $6,000 per parklet to install those. Wood is very expensive right now. We also have to apply a non-slip coating to those to make sure that people that are walking on them don't fall. We have about $2,000 in raw materials, about $2,000 for the plastic barricades, which are being used for the handrails, and about $1,800 in labor and equipment. Now, these will be less expensive to reinstall. It's just this was our initial upfront costs. We did build these sectionally, so we're able to take them out, store them, and put them back at a later date. So when we looked in some of the books, these costs are extremely high. I really question, they were pulled out of the Milwaukee manual, that cost estimates between $20,000 and $40,000. I'm hopefully assuming that that maybe included a full planning review, but you have to get engineered drawings. There's a lot to this. They are also publicly constructed options where we could look at building those structures, storing them off-site and bringing them back. There would be some initial cost, and in addition, we would need square footage to store those under cover, which we currently do not have. That's a fairly significant investment. And then we could also publicly construct permanent parklets, which again, we don't know that we would recommend due to possible business changes. It may be that the business that's behind that permanent parklet goes out of business, and the new business there, once those taken out, we would recommend that we keep this as a seasonal program if we want to move forward so that the businesses could request them and have them taken away again in the spring. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad for some additional information.
Additional information, some of which maybe made a little more sense at the beginning, but I was out last week, so we got a little bit of mixed up on the order. This is kind of taking out to the bigger perspective. You're getting a lot thrown at you. This is, again, I think it's just really important to underscore the difference between the temporary parklets that we've had to date and what we're talking about now, installation of permanent. I think as Jason's presentation pointed out, there's just a lot more involved in terms of the implications with going with the permanent. I think that was just, at least for me, one of the objectives to share with council today that, you know, I think the wording in the strategic plan was parklet program, and I think that's accurate because it really, I think, warrants more of a program approach than a project approach. But just stepping back, I mean, there was only 8. This information comes from a National American Planning Association analysis. Only 8 parklets in the U.S. In 2010, and then that's kind of really skyrocketed. I think some of these other points they're shown here that in terms of developing a permanent parklet program, where is it that we wanted to look at, and this next point kind of underscores that it's really more likely just showing who's going to use these. And the parklet neighborhoods are more likely to rent than residents in the parklet neighborhoods more likely to rent than own. They pay more in rent and part of non-family households. So there is, especially in the larger urban areas, a strong tie to millennials who tend to use these. The density of the adjacent residential neighborhoods correlates to successful, meaning higher density, such as mixed-use projects. And popularity is often linked to local government technical requirements in the approval process. So if you make them particularly, difficult to do, this is sort of basic 101 here. You're not going to see as many of them. In terms of the location, some of the key questions, and then the next couple of slides really just kind of throw a lot of questions at you that we were considering. particularly from a, you know, a long-range planning standpoint. Where would these go? The first one probably isn't terribly relevant if we're just talking about downtown. But the speed limits adjacent, typically 25, 30 miles per hour max. Where are your higher levels of pedestrian activity? Those tend to be the more successful parklets. Do we want to allow them just within the CBD zone, which we've had to date, or expand it to other areas of town? Again, these are things that probably need a little bit more analysis. As Jason mentioned, do we continue to allow them on 6th and 7th Streets? ODOT, we have an encroachment permit that we got to date for each of the last two parklet programs. There, to my knowledge, hasn't really been any dialogue with them or with, you know, the community as a whole. And you'll see at the end, that's one of the things we're recommending is a little bit more outreach to the community on these. On-street parking impacts. So obviously, if, you know, right now we're talking about 90-day permits that we did for the first phase and then the current one. But if you're going to convert these and remove the parking altogether, then that's, you know, what are the criteria are we going to be using to identify which parking spaces are going to be removed? What about the ADA implications? Those should be looked at. There was a pretty intensive study in San Francisco in 2011 talking about the number of people who stopped to engage in stationary activities. And this kind of ties into the economic development piece, which is why it was interesting to us and the, you know, the community development side. They're, you know, especially if they're publicly owned or what they call hybrid parklets, where they're like open only for the adjacent business for certain parts of the day, but then in the evening they're open to the general public. That you do still see people stopping and hanging out, and it can generate, you know, just for that presence, those people spending more money right there on those blocks. We've already talked about this one a little bit, the ownership public versus the private. To date, we've had the adjacent property owners come through with their sidewalk cafe permits, and then we've had an addendum for the parklet. So it's all been 100% driven by the property owners. But this question is saying, you know, are there some locations where it actually makes more sense that they are part of the city's park system in essence? That's how other communities have viewed them. You know, what about some limits on hours? Public safety needs to weigh in on some of their perspectives. And then, of course, the maintenance piece and who's maintaining them. The design, Jason showed you some photos of some existing ones. Wow, we found that actually several of these are designed by outside architects and not city staff. But, you know, of course, we have baseline standards, our building codes, some of those we're going to have to be complied with. And then the funding piece. So here's the call to action, informational today, kind of demonstrating to you what are some of the components that a parklet program would have to include. And then we've got several things listed there. Surveying the public on key parklet questions, such as location and year-round and on-street parking concerns, developing an inventory so that to date, we've had, you know, those 12 or so areas on 6 or 7 different blocks, you know, but where are the other? I mean, we could look at a little bit more extensive analysis on that. And then the downtown parking task force has not been solicited on this question either. And then we could also give you some, you know, more specific regulations on OLCC and Oregon Health Authority and et cetera on what are some of the other implications on a more permanent parklet. So, and then the last one there, follow up a workshop to review findings of the survey and new research.
Thanks, Brad. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Thanks for the nice presentation. Valerie?
Yes, thank you. It was a very good presentation, and you've been very busy, and I'm glad you took some time off. I do have a question of where do we stand on the Fifth Street lighting and that plaza that we had talked about? I mean, I know that's just been in the works for years, since 2015 when I first came on, and that's kind of laid down and nothing's been picked up with it. So I don't know whether that has any, play on us opening parklets or whatever. Are we still planning on doing that plaza? I mean, just kind of, curious.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Terrestrial Landscaping, I think, is that the name of the company?
Mm-hmm.
He completed the downtown
Master plan.
for lack of a better term, presented it to HBSC, presented it to COPA, and I believe one or two others after that plan was completed, I think about 6 months ago. There was general support. There were lots of different design concepts in that plan. The parkless was not one of those concepts. So it's a very good point. I mean, there has been some thinking that hasn't moved beyond those committee presentations at this point. I think there's some implications on the comprehensive plan and some other things that we need to look at to move that ahead. But because he has done, and I'm just not blanking on his name.
James Love.
James Love,
Thank you,
yeah.
James Love, because he has done quite a bit of thinking on the design issues, particularly related to downtown, would be a good resource. So that's a good point.
And then that goes back to, because weren't we going to put lighting down there too? I mean, I just think about all the things that we talked about, and I would hate to think that, those would drop off the mat. They are also in their urban renewal. I mean, this area is all in their urban renewal, isn't it?
The period lighting is still happening. We're planning on doing that with the Acorns continuing down G Street, if that's what you were referring to. And I wouldn't say it's directly related to the parklet discussion.
No, it's not, but I'm just saying it is the downtown area, and I know a lot of the downtown merchants are wondering whether that is ever if that's still planning on being continued forward. So that's, I guess, what my question.
Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I haven't heard about whatever Valerie was just talking about. I don't know if most of the council doesn't have any idea, since a lot of us are new. So if there's anything that could be shared with us, I would appreciate that. And then you also said that currently the concrete barriers that we use, those are owned privately, and do we just borrow them and then give them back?
Yeah, Riverside Ready Mix has been very generous. They have quite a few extras, so for a fee, of course, they bring them down, drop them, and then for another fee, they come and pick them up for us.
Do you have any idea of how much they would cost if we were to purchase them?
I do not, but we're not really equipped to move or place them. They have special equipment for that, so we would likely still incur a very similar cost to hire somebody to come and do that for us without obtaining that equipment.
Okay,
But
yeah,
I can look into it.
The reason I bring that up is I've had several business owners downtown comment on the fact that they do want to be able to kind of make them more aesthetically pleasing, and since the city doesn't own them and they're privately owned, they don't really have the ability to do that. Gotcha. So I think, depending on where this conversation goes, I have received that feedback.
I'll look into that.
Okay.
Rick?
Brian, I didn't know if we could explore the possibility of different, I would say, drapery designs or something like that would allow the colorful display of those barriers and yet not affecting the barrier per se. And I know sometimes when you rent an apartment, if you decide to color a wall, you have to paint it back to the original color. Has any of that been considered in just throwing that out there, if that would be another question to ask? If, I don't know what, like I said, take a rug and drape it over that. Thank you.
I've been to California a couple of times in the past year and seen a number of different cities that are using parklets, and this is actually the only city that I've seen that has the massive concrete barricades. And some places have, you know, some cones or maybe one end blocked off, but most places that I've been to have more decorative wooden. Some of them are made with pallets even to be kind of economical, but ours are definitely quite sturdy. There's probably some way even to keep some of that sturdiness and yet, you know, have a more attractive fence all at the same time if we go about it. Just to touch on the Fifth Street, there's been a plan in the works for some time to convert the Owl parking lot to a multi-use parking lot / plaza that perhaps would have things like rounded off curbs so that it kind of flows more into the street, because it's often used for First Friday events as well as the Chalk Art Festival, and then to put up some decorative lighting, Christmas style lights, you know, white lights hanging over the street. Kind of keeps getting pushed around for various reasons, ends up being a bigger project than it seemed like it would be several years ago. But it's a little bit, it's related to outdoor spaces downtown, in that sense it ties in, but it won't particularly help the businesses who are looking to serve their customers right in front of their restaurant. So in that sense, it's not really related here. But I think the council's interested, it seems like, in moving forward. Do you have other questions? We've got Rob and then Vanessa.
Well, I don't have a question, I have comments.
Okay. Any questions before? Okay, go for it, Rob.
Okay. I think it's important to remember why we first started the parklets, and really it was a matter of survival for the restaurants. As clear as could be, that was the motivation. They needed them to survive. They were going out of business. And I know that when I surveyed probably every business owner on the south side of G Street in December, several of them were agreeable to the parklets for that reason. They wanted to help their neighboring restaurants. Several, you know, some people were against it, some people were for it, some people were definitely for it to be able to keep the restaurants in business. That was their reason. I think, I'm not sure if, how many people in the room are kind of dialed into tourism and things like that, but it's very clear to me anyway, and it's clear to, I sent an article actually to the councilors last week from the Boston Globe. It's very clear that almost everywhere around the country, tourism is going to explode this summer. There's so much pent-up demand. It's just, business is going to be fantastic this summer, unless there's some kind of horrible recurrence of the virus, you know. So I guess in the newspaper last week, the Courier, they mentioned there was, I think, 94% occupancy with the restaurants right now in April. Not the restaurants, the hotels in April. So we're ready to explode. There's no doubt about that. So for those reasons, I think that this, while it's great to plan and think about this, I think that discussions of the long term for parklets, I think, are really premature. I think that we should see this summer what business is like. We should see what parking demands are like, which may affect what the other, the other businesses in the area feel, how they feel about the parklets, depending on what, again, what the demand is, what the parking demands are. And as Jason touched on, businesses can change. I mean, we've got one on G Street that actually was basically evicted by their landlord last week, and that's changing, but I think another restaurant's going to be taking over. But they can change, but the point is that we need to clearly involve all the landlords as well. So all the business owners, all the landlords need to be included. And the parking impacts need to be assessed, I think, after COVID is over and after we see what the summer is like and what the fall is like. When I think of what I consider to be the best outdoor venue in Grants Pass, I look at the River's Edge restaurant, which is just, I wouldn't even care if they didn't even serve me food. I just like sitting out there. And it's really nice, but only in the summer. So I don't go there in the winter really at all, but the summer is amazing. I have to question whether or not next winter, we're talking November, December, January, et cetera, if there's indoor dining allowed at full capacity on all of our restaurants, will there be any demand at all for the parklets? And I just can't imagine people would want to stay outside in the cold and the wet if they could sit inside when it was warm and dry. They were somewhat successful this year because they couldn't sit inside. So I think that most of this discussion is really premature. And I think we need to base whether or not we have a demand after we've had we'll say a normal tourist season and potentially a normal fall season. And then we'll also get to a more accurate reading on how the landlords feel and what the other tenants or the other neighboring businesses feel. So to decide this now, I think, is just really, really premature. I also like to add, too, that, I'm not sure how many councilors realize it, but when you have a special event, whether it's Art Along the Road or the antique sale or any of those things, the organizers of those events have to go around door to door and get every single, interview every single merchant in that area for opinion and so forth. And it gives a better idea of, hey, how many people actually are for this thing. But I think that, again, even for this right now, it would be premature to do that until after we've seen a normal tourist summer and potentially a normal, at least fall or early winter to see, and then we'll know where kind of everybody stands and whether or not even the business owners, I find, I ran a restaurant for 15 years and we probably had a line at least half the nights we were open. It was very successful. And I have to say that I could never have handled another, 20 or 30% capacity outside. My kitchen couldn't have handled it, My refrigeration couldn't have handled it as far as storing things. So I've got to wonder, when the restaurants are full capacity, would they be able to handle, an additional 20 or 30% capacity, which is out in the street? So there's so many unanswered questions. And that's just the way I look at it right now. I think it's great that we did it. I think everyone agrees it was a success. As many restaurants could stay in business and make some money and pay their mortgages at home and pay their rents because we did it. But I also think that as we go back to normal, I think that's what we should be, is kind of back to normal, and then ask some of the questions I just brought up.
Vanessa?
Yeah, to reply to that, Councillor Pell, I understand where you're coming from. I think it's going to be difficult to wait for normalcy to make that decision. The increased visitation to our community is going to be a response from folks being prohibited from traveling and asked to quarantine. So it could be a year or 2 years before we really get back to some sense of normalcy pre-pandemic. I can speak as a consumer that also pre-pandemic, that myself and my network, we would specifically choose dining facilities that had outdoor dining in nicer weather. So that was an attractive portion as a consumer. And as well, when I visited other tourist communities, just like Mayor Bristol had said, most tourist communities have a parklet program of some kind offering that outside dining for people. So I would be in favor of moving forward with all of the alternatives and the potential next steps. I would like to add a couple. I believe that we should explore other commercial zones in the city, as well as soliciting feedback from the Tourism Advisory Committee. Once we have more of a defined idea of what we may be offering for the parklet program, whether that's pedestrian, moved around the sidewalk and allowing them or moving the tables out on the street. I think getting their feedback would be valuable.
Thank you. Valerie?
Yeah, I would agree with Vanessa. I think, talking with the people downtown is very important, but I also feel like she mentioned, I would prefer to go to a place that's outside if the weather's nice. For a lot of reasons. I think we've all been trained through this pandemic to recognize, things that we may not have recognized earlier, but how nice it is to be outside, how much more comfortable we feel. I also think that the parking thing needs to be really vetted through the parking task force, because we know that's reality. I think we'll gain a lot of knowledge from this next season and know how that impacts us And then also getting the OLCC and all those agencies to give us some feedback, I think would be a good thing as well.
Brian?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what they just said. I think there's a lot of positives to the Parklet program, and those are pretty evident. And to me, it seems the one big negative is that it takes away parking. That's really the only kind of big issue that I see with the Parklet program. So if we can find ways to somehow mitigate that, I think that, you know, a lot of the concerns that people would have about this would be alleviated. So that really seems kind of like the sticking point to me, is just the parking concern. And if we can get over that, then we can enjoy all the other benefits that the Parklet program provides without any issues.
I have a question. Brad, you mentioned in the presentation that the cost of this is reimbursable due to COVID, or looks like Jason's stepping up, but.
So this go around, yes, COVID was able to help pay for these supplies and for the installation because we were getting businesses back to work. So our costs have been pretty neutral this go around.
Do you know if that's still true if we were to do some of the more expensive wood? They were very, very nice, by the way. I ate at 2 different 6th Street restaurants with them over the past week, so.
Good.
To answer the question of whether CARES Act funding can be used to pay for the Parklet programs due to the temporary nature of the programs that we had last year and what have been set up for this year, that is in direct response to COVID. When you start the conversation of making it permanent, the line gets a little grayer in that, is it in response to COVID or is it for future economic stimulus? So a balance between the two would be less objectionable than just outright saying we're paying for parklets that we're going to keep in place for 5 years. That would make the use of CARES Act funding a little more questionable.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Rob?
So I'm unclear after listening to Vanessa, Valerie, and Brian. Are you all like gung-ho for year-round parklets that never get removed? Are you willing to make that kind of decision now, or are you saying that they should be there for the summer? In other words, how much are you saying we should invest potentially? Are we investing in a long-term plan before we know long-term implications of what it's going to be like? So I'm unclear exactly. I mean, everyone seems to like the parklets, especially right now and in the good weather. I'm just curious as to what it is you're actually supporting when you say parklets.
Vanessa?
I think most importantly, we move forward with surveying the public and the key parklet questions and really moving downtown and asking those stakeholders and seeing what that looks like and moving forward from there.
Valerie?
I would agree too. I would agree with that, is basically, and I have a question for Aaron on this one. Currently, they're set up, is it set up for another 90 days, or how long are they currently set up for?
It was originally temporary for 90 days, so technically to move into the summer, you would need to reaffirm that or extend it or do something along those lines. So I'll have to bring that in front of you for an extension if you'd like.
But we could extend it through the summer and just
Most
extend
definitely.
what we're doing now and then do the currently what we're talking about before we move forward with anything permanent.
You bet. You can extend it through the outdoor season, which could be October or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Do you think it's reasonable that we could do a survey prior to having to bring back that 90-day discussion so that we could readdress this in 60 days or something?
Yeah, I'm sure we can. We've got a good list to do outreach with, whether it be through email or door-to-door stuff, and we could see what we get by sending an email out to the downtown merchants first as a response, and maybe we need to do some foot traffic also downtown once we gather some information on what we'd be presenting to them.
I think we've also heard Tourism Advisory Committee, downtown businesses, and just the general public maybe Let's go Brian, Rob, Rick.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Rob's question really quick. I think there is potential for year-round parklets, potentially. I don't know, but I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. I also think that it would be good if we're going to be giving city right-of-way to businesses to make more money, that they are, either paying rent on that space, or, there were some recommendations in here. City-owned or business-owned liability insurance includes the city, so we don't have that liability. So I do see some potential, and I do agree that it's premature, but I just want to keep having the conversation.
Rob?
So I would actually be in favor of extending this through the summer, and I would actually, like at that point to get a sense from all the stakeholders, landlords, business owners, et cetera. How did it go for you this summer? Good business, normal business. Was parking an issue? Was it not an issue? Et cetera, et cetera. So I'd actually be for extending it because a lot of people did like it, but I'd actually like to take a sober look at it, we'll say, in the fall, when we actually can then go out and survey everybody when they've actually seen what it's like to live with parklets during a busy season. And then also, rather than everybody, you interview any kid and do you want free candy? Of course you want free candy. But if the landlords or the business owners actually have to pay for part of the parklets, their answer might be different. So I think there's a lot of, we'll call it adult questions to be answered or asked, but I would be okay with moving forward with extending them this summer, and then basically people can have an educated opinion, in October, November, whatever.
Rick? Oh, Aaron?
Yeah, it brings up a point. What I'm hearing here out of the dais is, if you'd like, we could just bring a resolution to you under consent to extend it through the summer, and you could just approve that through a consent calendar item if you want, and we can have that for a future business meeting. And then when it comes to the survey, as we're discussing this, the timing of the survey, it may be more appropriate to have the survey more towards the later part of the program than try to get a survey out right now, because I'm not sure unless I know if I need clearer direction on exactly what your purpose, what the exact questions you're asking to provide you with information to make an informed decision on. I'm not sure what, or we just wait and see what the experience is like through this season, and then we develop a survey based on the experiences and what we're hearing in the community through that time.
Rick?
I like both comments that Rob had made and Aaron had made. I'd be in favor of continuing the current project as it is, and as we go down further, then contacting the business owners and see how they like this season, how it's gone. But I also feel as we look into and start moving down the road on long term, that the whole picture be looked at. And Councilor DeLaGrange has some different ideas that I think he could bring forward later that he's approached me with, that I think warrant with a new survey with the owners. Then it's time to also, when you're looking at permanent, look at some other ideas and bring those forward at the same time. Thank you.
All right, Valerie?
I'm just going to concur and say also, the reality of it is, it's always nice, like you said, when everything's paid for and we're doing it for the city and everything is at this point COVID related. But the reality of it is the cost, the maintenance, and their buy-in would have to be a part of it. So let's see how this summer goes, and at the end of it, we'll have the discussion, and they may just be of the feeling that yes, it brought in so much more business that it's worth us putting forward and investing in it as well. But they wouldn't know that right now. So, great idea.
Are we in need of any guidelines for decorating this year, or is that taken care of?
Well, for decorating right now, we would have to try to explore what our options are for either purchasing what's been set out there from a concrete block standpoint, or permission to decorate the concrete blocks. or something along those lines, we would need to figure out what those options are, because I think those are the ones you're primarily talking about. The other ones, I understand optically may not be as attractive as they could be, but they're more attractive than those concrete blocks.
Well, I know one of the businesses does have some Christmas lights strung up kind of overhead. Is there anything prohibiting or anything that needs to be addressed with that? No?
No, mm-mm.
Okay.
It's just the physical alteration of the infrastructure that has been placed there.
Okay. Is council, it sounds like people are interested in adding this item to a consent calendar to extend through the summer and then having some sort of survey later in the summer that would be comprehensive. Do we still have questions and comments? Okay, Rob.
So I'd like to agree with what Rick said earlier, or take off on that point. I think with one phone call, we could find out if we're allowed to paint those and make them more attractive. And his point there afterwards, we may have to promise just to paint them back, when we're done with them. Or they may not have that much use for them. They may be totally happy to have them painted. They put them in storage with the thought that they'd be used the same way when they're brought out again. I like the idea of having, quite frankly, for safety reasons, a massive barrier between seated people and moving vehicles. I mean, it's terrifying to me to think, I would never sit in that roadway if I didn't have some massive thing in between me and a vehicle. But I think with one phone call, we could find out, are we allowed to paint them? And if not, could we paint them if we painted them back? I think it was a really good point.
Rick.
I like what Rob is saying, but also we could look into possibly the idea of chalk art on the barriers, and also there are water soluble paints that would really pressure wash off real easily and yet provide an attractive different, that might be an idea as well. Thank you.
Vanessa.
I'm in support of moving forward through resolution, extending the parklet program through the summer, and then revisiting the topic at the end of that in the fall, and surveying the stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. Is everybody else in agreement with that plan? Seeing all heads nod. Okay, we'll move forward with that plan. Next up, we are going to review a letter of support for transportation earmark for the South Y.
I want to offer an apology first. My watermark did not print on this letter, and I do apologize. This is a draft copy of the letter, and what this is a letter of support from the City Council, signed by the mayor, or which could be, asking the federal government for an earmark to support a study which would be driven by Oregon Department of Transportation. It's called an environmental assessment, which would identify solutions to traffic at the South Y. Those solutions could be everything from flyovers at the South Y to construction of a fourth bridge. They really do not know what those solutions are. They also are having a hard time getting funding for this project. And we just thought, they're asking for earmarks. Let's go ahead and get us in the queue and see if we can get a multi-agency project going that would at least start to identify what the issues are that need to be addressed in the South Y, beyond the massive congestion that you face from about 12 o'clock on. So with that, I'm free to answer any questions for you. I'm at your discretion.
Did anyone have any questions? Brian?
So it looks like we're asking essentially for $2.5 million for this?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any sort of range of cost that these applications can be?
I actually am very unfamiliar. I have never asked for an earmark in a federal bill in my life. So we are very much in uncharted territory. I don't know that there is, but you have to have like a good background to be able to get that earmark pushed through.
Is all the documentation that's before us,
Yeah.
is that all of the documentation that will be on the application for the earmark?
We have asked for a letter of support from ODOT as well, and I'm waiting to hear back on that. But so far, yes, this is what we have available.
Okay.
Rob?
So I have concerns and a question. I know that when we did the 6th Street Bridge restoration, it really affected drivability, traffic, et cetera, et cetera. There were plenty of people on either side of the river who stayed on their side of the river. I can imagine that the South Y project would be that times 10. I think we're going to be divided north and south for several years. And so I'm wondering why we wouldn't consider the 4th Bridge project first, because there really is virtually no negative to that one, and it would help mitigate the negative of the South Y. Anybody that lives in a whole southwest section would have an easy way to get across the river if there's a 4th bridge, thereby taking the pressure off the South Y when the South Y is being worked on. And I have to say, I've spoken with several people about this, just citizens about this in the last week. Every single one of them says it's like, you know, they slap their head and say, of course, why wouldn't we do the South Y, the 4th Bridge first? Because the South Y problem would be less than it would end up to be, less impact, negative impacts. The other point I'd make, I don't know, or it's a question I have, I don't drive that much, but I've never waited, I don't remember ever waiting for more than one light cycle at the South Y. I mean, what do traffic studies show there? Do people wait 2 or 3 light cycles now? Because I never have.
Yes, especially between about 4 and 6 p.m. And where it gets exceedingly bad is as you're heading to the west. It really starts backing up at Ringette, and as you're trying to get off at Redwood Avenue, that really backs up, and same thing as they're coming in on the Parkway, trying to get across, it really does back up there pretty significantly.
So is there an estimate as to how much, especially as you say you're going to the west, if you had a 4th bridge, that problem would be probably 50% less? We wouldn't even have that problem if it was a 4th bridge, probably. I mean, is there an estimate on that? Or?
There is, it's in the transportation. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, and I apologize for that. The reason that the South Y was chosen is because it would likely get more feedback, and we're not asking to do the project. The EAS will only identify alternatives that then we're able to pursue. One of those alternatives might be the 4th bridge. However, if we move forward with a 4th bridge project, it's likely that it would be solely Grants Pass that would be responsible for funding a 4th bridge project. Whereas if it's an identified alternative to correct the deficiencies in the South Y, there's more potential for us to be sharing those costs with other agencies such as ODOT and Josephine County. That was kind of one of the reasons that we had chosen the South Y first.
Brian, and then Valerie.
Thank you for explaining all of this. It's helpful. I'm just wondering, this doesn't look too involved. I mean, there's like 20 questions. It's like 6 pages. So could we submit a second one to get an EAS for the 4th Bridge and West Park Street and Lincoln and that whole, because I mean, that is, that's an equal size transportation issue. Could we submit 2 or not?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Okay. I would be in favor of submitting 2 because they're both very important, and it's kind of just putting it out. We don't know what's going to happen with them, and if we put out 2, I would think that we would be more likely to at least get one of them.
Valerie?
Yeah, this is kind of, and I can sympathize with Jason, this is kind of like a sudden thing. I mean, it's just like all of a sudden, because this transportation is coming down, suddenly the Democrats are saying, let's get some earmarks on this at the same time. So it's kind of come before, and at the meeting, I actually went to the TAC meeting because I kind of heard it was coming down the pike, and I was feeling like you were. It's just like, I am more familiar with the bottleneck and thinking that that fourth bridge could really make a difference out in the Redwood area, because that's where we visually see it. I just will not go to that side of the river. And like you said, in terms of going to Williams Highway, I don't ever feel that same tension as I do knowing as soon as I turn off near Bimart, it's going to be nothing. So I do understand that debate, and I'm kind of in the same place. I'm wondering, that'd be great if we could go for both of them, and then there was a shot. And it might be nice to get the impact from ODOT as well, too, what they're able to support, of what they're willing to support. If the South Hawaii study is the one that will give us the ability to have more people on board, then I would go with that, because that's been one of the things that has hesitated, what we've hesitated a lot with on this fourth bridge, is if we have to pay for it, it's never going to happen. So it's really imperative that we get the other people on board, especially the state, to help. But if there's any earmarks in a federal that could get us a bridge, that would be awesome too. So I like his idea of maybe putting forth 2. This is for simply the South Hawaii study. It's not doing South Hawaii. It's simply a study. And if that is the case, either way, that might be the first priority, if that will help us to get that bridge and have them pay for it. But I think the bridge is going to be the answer. So I'm going to say I would like to have you talk with ODOT, and actually I have a funny feeling it might be brought up at the MRMPO meeting Thursday. And so at that time I will bring up and kind of gauge also where ODOT's leaning with that.
Joel?
Jason, since this is federal legislation, there's a fairly quick turnaround on this. When do you need an answer by?
We have to submit this by Wednesday.
Wednesday, so I would say let's go with the letter, and if it turns out that planning says we need a fourth bridge and it'll get people on board, then so be it. That's what I would do.
Well, and knowing that it has to be on Wednesday and the MRMP is on Thursday, then you're right. I would agree that it just needs to be sent off, and then that would hopefully lead down the road to that.
Does anyone have any concerns about the letter that need to be addressed before we sign off and send it off? Nope. All right.
And if I could, I do want to offer an apology to you and to Ward Warren. I did misrepresent what he said. He did not tell me that he would be here. What he did tell me was that he was looking forward to seeing my presentation. But I did not get a, yes, I will be there, and I wanted to apologize because I misrepresented what he told me to you. He did not say that he would be here, so I apologize.
Okay, and that was regarding the parking signage meeting?
It was, yes.
Okay, thank you. We'll sign the letter a little later today. Next up, we have agenda review. And next Monday, we are going to be talking about ourselves a bit. So we're going to have a presentation with the HR director discussing the evaluation process for the city manager and kind of giving those of us who are new a heads up about what that process will look like. And then we have quite a list that I'm putting together for you regarding council procedures, where the city manager and council president and I met last week to discuss a list of ideas that we had and you had about different ways that we've been handling our own business. And so I am going to work on getting that to you as soon as I can this week, so you can all have a chance to think about those things before we get together next Monday. And then we're also going to discuss the DMO contract again. That one has snuck back in here. Yeah, I don't know what that means, because I was trying so hard to hold the 19th to just ourselves, but DMO contract, Valerie or Aaron, do you know what's going on there?
We've been trying to move really fast with this. I wouldn't be opposed at all to delaying this for another time. Mark hasn't had an opportunity to receive any comments back yet from their attorney on the contract changes. So it may be appropriate for us but we've been trying to be as accommodating as possible to the DMO board, and they're wanting to go as fast as possible also. So it's really up to council on how fast we go, but I think we would appreciate some extra time.
Okay. Valerie?
All I can say is I know that I think we meet on Wednesday with Mark to kind of look over the contract. So we haven't even had a chance to move further either, so.
Okay, next Monday, maybe a little too fast on both ends. Okay, we're gonna bump that one down the road then. Yeah,
So I was wondering on Monday, since that's moved off of there, we do have something that we need to discuss in a fairly quick turnaround because there's some funding that's available to the city. And it's the local chapter of the Historical Society, E. Clampus Vitus, has obtained a grant from a local four-way foundation that will pay 100% of the cost of a historical marker. This is at 6th and G Street to commemorate the 1927 Redwood Native American Marathon run from San Francisco to Grants Pass. And it would be it's less than $10,000 grant, but it would be a fairly 4 feet wide, 5 feet high brick, very well done, and it could be something right there by the Welcome Center. And I was wondering if at the April 19th workshop, if we could hear a presentation on that and then see if we want to do that in a timely manner.
all right, council, is there interest in adding that to the 19th? Is that a yes for, okay, not a question. Okay, I'm seeing Rob and Valerie and Vanessa, Brian,
Do
okay.
you want me to give you this so you know what we're talking about?
Is it the email that Ward sent?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we all have that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So that's the sign for the marathon. Okay. Okay, and then, so then coming up next Wednesday, we would have the Wednesday business meeting. It's Drinking Water Week proclamation. We've got a public hearing to consider an ordinance that would have a development code text amendment. What does CLG stand for? Certified Local Government, thank you. And then an ordinance consideration for a development code text amendment regarding multi-dwelling residence / solar. Okay. Public hearing for the CDBG needs and priorities. Public hearing for designating heritage trees at Martin Park and a heritage tree at the water treatment plant. Second reading for the comprehensive plan zone amendment for Grants Pass Downs that we heard last week. And then on council action, we have the DMO contract, which is, actually that's moved. Residential bulk water rate, following up on that. Consent calendar, we have January, February financial report, a resolution on open space rough mowing, resolution appointing a city manager as CM budget officer. Is that what that means? City manager budget officer, and a resolution appointing the city manager URA budget officer. Fair amount of stuff there. Any questions about any of that?
I have one just to point out. I'm not sure if you want to keep it on there or not. The DMO Executive Director search, I know you're aware of what that is. If council is still going to be comfortable providing authority to contract for those services, then we can leave it on there. But if before, I thought there was some question about the contract needed to be more solidified before you feel comfortable with the $25,000. If so, we should probably move that to the May 5th meeting also, along with the DMO contract, and do those together.
I think it says on here 255. It actually does have that on there.
Yeah, I think
It
we need
does.
to move that on. Okay. Rob, you mentioned earlier in the day a potential ad hoc committee having to do with wayfinding those signs down in the downtown area. Is the council interested in pursuing something on a committee for wayfinding? Or how do we
I'm
want to?
assuming that's different than parking, so I just want to make sure that the
Well, that would kind of
clarification.
expand on the, the
Okay.
parking was step one, but we have a number of other signs that point to various parks and attractions.
I think that'd be the next step. I think what we could do is we could just have on a future workshop. We've got relatively good direction from the parking task force and their recommendations. We can just move forward with an action plan on that, unless council wants to further go into it more. I think we've got good direction on where to go and how to proceed.
Yeah, Rob?
I think that's a good idea to have a workshop, and then if there's anything after the workshop, then that's still in question, we could potentially form a very small committee for 1 or 2 meetings to give more clarification.
All right. Anything else? Brian?
Yeah, we had 3 motions come through from Housing Committee at our last meeting, and those are all fairly substantial motions, and they're all pertaining to 3-star items in the strategic plan, and I think it would be wise of us to get those on the agenda as soon as we can.
Thanks for the reminder. One thing to keep in mind as we do start getting up closer to May here, you guys are going to be real busy in May with budget hearings. So obviously we do want to not put the brakes on everything else, but we need to probably prioritize your time in May and stick to the highlights. Yeah, Rob.
I sent out an email earlier today regarding the next time we're going to hear the adult use ordinance, and I was just wondering, it had been suggested that it was going to be into June, and my question was there any legal reason it couldn't be at the May 19th meeting?
So, yeah, I did respond to that email, Counselor. The main issue has to do with the timing between the UAPC public hearing. So UAPC holds their public hearing, and then they have to adopt findings of fact. They meet on the 2nd and 4th Wednesdays. So the only way that you could move it from June 2nd to May 19th would be to direct the UAPC to hold a special meeting that's before their regular meeting. That's, yeah.
I forgot about the findings of fact time lag. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Any new ideas for upcoming topics? Agenda review? Nope. Okay. In that case, I will entertain a motion to move into executive session. Valerie.
I make a motion that we move into an executive session.
Thank you. Rick
Second.
with the second. All right, all in favor of adjourning into executive session, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. The council will now meet in executive session for the purpose of discussing those subjects previously noticed for this executive session. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660, and more specifically under the subsections of that statute which have been publicly noticed for this meeting. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. At the end of the executive session, we will return to open session and welcome the audience back into the room. And with that, we'll take a short recess.